The floors of Winterfell remembered the old fire. Even with winter thick on the land and the snows drifted to the tower windows like a second wall, warmth crept up through the flagstones, gentled the cold from her bones, and fogged Sansa's breath so that it hovered near her face and did not bite like glass. On those mornings when Ramsay was hunting and the yard lay emptied of his laughter and his dog's frantic baying, she would slip from her chamber with her hood low, past the patched tapestries and the dark iron sconces, and walk as far as she dared where the steam threaded and the stone sweated. It was a furtive pilgrimage, not to any shrine but to the idea of her house. Down narrow steps to an alcove where a wolf had been carved with a craftsman's patience and long-forgotten pride, along galleries whose corners held shadows that seemed to watch. Winterfell had grown in rings the way a tree grows, and in its oldest circles it kept its secrets. She went there to listen. All castles had their noises. A groan in the door as if it were an old soldier speaking, a drip that marked time, mice rustling like a covert army in the walls. Winterfell had more. There was a low breath in it, steady and patient as the sea. Sansa could not decide if she had failed to note it as a child because childish ears heard only laughter and the clang of practiced swords, or if it were truly a new thing, born of the burning and the rebuilding and the trespass of strangers in halls her father had kept. Whichever, she heard it now. Some days it seemed nearer, as if it had drawn itself up closer to the floors to lay its heat against her feet. She told herself stories as she walked, that had been necessary once, in King's Landing, to survive the days, to guard a piece of herself from being used up. Here it became a habit whose form was softer. She would picture Snow, her dire wolf, bounding ahead of her, letting out that foolish, rattled bark like laughter. She would imagine Lady and Arya squabbling over who stepped on whose heel, breathe the perfume of boar roast and buttered beets from a feast that was over and done before she was woman-high. The mind could travel when the body could not. She had first gone down to the old kitchens, ruined by the fire, and stood among the ovens like great mouths choked with ash. Steam rose there through grates in the floor, and for a fancy she set her palm above one to catch what rose and pretended it was smoke from her old life. The steam smelled of warmed stone, of nothing. In the night she dreamed of it, and in the dream it had a taste like iron. Theon found her the second time she broke her route. He came into the corridor with his shoulders hunched as if from a habit of flinching, and stopped when he saw her. He had forgotten how to fill his own body. He wore himself like a borrowed cloak. In the weeks since she had come, he had kept to his corners. He was kept to his corners, and she had not sought him. He had built a house, and it had been Winterfell, and that house had been burned, and the girl who had lived there had thought him the builder. The thought sat in her like a stone too large to swallow. He had a tray balanced on his palms, a dingy cloth draped over it. "My lady," he murmured, and every word was an apology. "They told me to bring." "No," she said, because it was easier to cut the apology off than to accept it and make something of it. "Not now. I don't." He stood very still, not because he respected her words, but because he measured danger in every movement now, gauging the air for where it might strike. She had seen men behave that way around Ramsay. It made her skin crawl to see it in Theon Greyjoy. Her father had taken him into their home and made him a brother of sorts. She had been a child with a child's trust. She could have prayed to forget his face. But in this castle full of strangers and men who called her by names she had no claim to anymore. She could not find the strength to turn him away. He was a shard of Winterfell, even broken, perhaps especially broken. "Walk with me," she said at last. The words surprised them both. He shifted the tray, uncertain. "If I leave this," he began. She lifted her hand in a gesture she had learned in King's Landing, delicate as lace and just as useful. He fell silent and shadowed her steps, and they went together down a stair that had been worn a little bowl-shaped by centuries of feet. The heat took them more completely there. It licked their faces with damp tongues. Sansa lifted her hood back, letting the damp darken her hair. Theon breathed through his mouth, and when he swallowed she heard the click in his thin throat. It was foolish, perhaps a lunatic's notion, to think that following the warmth would lead her to the answer of the breath she had heard. But she had so little that was hers that to call this folly and abandon it would be an injury she could not afford. They passed the sealed door that led to the old wine cellars. The key for that was kept elsewise now, and nothing beyond would be left for her but emptiness and the ache of craving, and followed the narrow crooked corridor to a place where the stones had shifted. That had been since the snows, men said. The weight pressed in strange ways, and the earth under Winterfell moved like an old animal settling in its sleep. One slab had upended and laid itself like a toppled book. Through the angle it made with the floor, steam-ribboned, thicker and more certain than it had in the kitchen. "Don't," Theon said, soft as a prayer, when she bent and put her fingers to the crack. Sansa turned to look at him. "Don't what? Don't go in there." He did not look at the crack as he spoke. He looked at her, searching her face for the place where the girl he had wronged might be. "There are places in this castle that he doesn't like us to go. And is he here?" She lifted her chin and listened. "No dogs, no voices." Somewhere very distant a man coughed. The St. kissed her knuckles. "If he asks, I'll say I was there to pray. It's as good a lie as any." She made herself thin and went sideways into the gap. The stones scraped her wool, but not her skin. Theon hesitated only a heartbeat before he came after her, with the caution of a man who has learned that to leave a lady alone invites all manner of ruin. The space on the far side had not been made by men. The corridor had ended in a wall once. That wall had cracked along a seam older than the hand that had set it, and opened not into another corridor laid and measured by human minds, but into a bubble in the earth, a belly. It was long as a hall and higher than any of the cellars, and not entirely dry. Sansa's skin prickled at the sight. It was what she had half hoped for and half feared. The floor sloped and knuckled. The stone had the look of melted wax, as if at some very old time something had run soft here, then cooled and hardened to this frozen wave. In a shallow along the right-hand wall rose a spring. It was not the tame, cupped thing of such springs above that fed the baths. This was a spout that sent water up like breathing, with a sound between burble and sigh. Steam rolled and took the light apart into tatters. There was no light. Sansa did not know what made her think that. There was no torch in her hand. She had brought none. Yet she could see, a little, and the little made her certain of shapes and unquiet at once. The dimness had a color like embered iron, enough to set the hairs on her arms standing. She took a step. The stone had bite beneath her boot, a gritty texture. The spring breathed, and there, not water, not steam, not anything she had a name for, was a ridge against the far wall, the shallow largest circle in the room. It was the color of wet slate, and it glowed, dim and pulse-like, as if it were drawing breath. The sound she had heard in the corridors above grew larger here, not by volume but by nearness, as if what made it was not singing but existing. Theon laid a hand on her sleeve. His touch was barely there. "Please," he said. He did not look terrorized, not as he looked in Ramsay's presence. He looked as if he had stumbled into a childhood thing by accident, like seeing the ghost of a mother you had nearly forgotten. She wanted to step nearer, pulled her the way the hearth pulls one in winter. She took another step and then another, cautious by instinct and by the knowledge of her own foolishness, certain only that if she reached the ridge she would put her hand to it as she had the stone elsewhere and read with her palm what her eyes could not. She thought of her father's hand on her hair when she had been small, and he had told her a story of the kings who were carved with stone wolves at their feet. She thought of the weirwood in the god's wood, the red of its eyes and the running of its sap like blood in rhyme. She thought of Lady, dead and gone so that a girl could learn the lesson that nothing belonged to her, nothing ever did. Not even the thing that loved her in the clean animal way that said love needed no courtly words. What was this but a story? What was this but a thing that had waited because it had to, not because it had patience? Her boot slid a little on grit. She steadied herself. She was within an arm's reach now. She lifted her hand. Theon made a sound no one would ever wish to make. There was no changing the course. She gave her hand to the ridge. It was not stone. Stone was indifferent. Stone kept its temperature with the stubbornness of old things. Stone yielded nothing save the scratch it was willing to give a ring or a blade. This had a gift to it like metal that had known the forge. Her palm went to it and it pressed back a fraction. not with malice, not with welcome. It was the press of any living thing that recognizes contact. It was warm, though the warmth was peculiar. It came through the skin and did not sit on it, the way the baths did. It was heat like the breath under all the floors, gathered, focused. Sansa's breath went from her in a small, shocked sound. The ridge under her hand sighed. Exactly that. It sighed. The darkness changed. There were colors in it now that she could not name because the words she had grown up with were meant for banners and dresses and embroidery thread. For violets growing in the glass garden and the green of the pond when it had algae. This was color older than that, like the inside of a banked coal. She thought wildly that if she could look down her own throat as she breathed, this might be what she'd see. She took her hand away because she had nothing left to give, and the contact felt like giving. Theon had fallen to his knees. He did not seem to know he had done it. The tray had slid from his hands, the cloth fallen, a crust of bread dark as if it had burned before it warmed, a stub of cheese, a handful of dried apples like shriveled ears. Those lay scattered now, the food he had been sent to bring her to test if she would rise to a bit when baited by kindness. The steam beaded his lashes. He had not wept. He had not that much left in him, perhaps. "Oh," he said. He said it as if the word were the last he had and he had hoarded it. Sansa knelt also, from some wish to be small in the presence of what deserved it. She waited. She wanted to speak, though she had nothing proper to say. The ridge rose, only a finger's worth, but she felt the air shift. A smell came, not from the water as she had imagined, but from the thing under her hand. Iron and salt and the faintest ghost of a smell that had haunted the kennels when she had been a child and the bitches had whelped. Membrane and newness. No, older. Older by far. There is a dragon under Winterfell, she thought. It startled her to name it because she had not intended to name it. It felt blasphemous and necessary. She had never seen a dragon. She had seen 7-pointed stars hammered in gold in Baelor's September. She had watched fire climb the sept's candles until it gnawed the wick to nothing. She had listened to a queen speak of dragons as if they were a word she could own, as if by saying it and being silver and beautiful she became the owner of the thing. Here, in the belly of her father's castle, the word belonged to the dark and to the old. It didn't feel like a Targaryen word. It felt like a northern word, said with a little gravel in the throat. A word the first men had had and laid down when they had learned fear of the Red Priest's fires. She did not mean to speak. She did. "I am Sansa Stark," she said, and the words caught in the air and sounded foolish and sublime at once. The ridge moved again, no more than before. There was a low groan then, not in the air but in something that held up the world. A stone somewhere in the castle above them settled. She heard that too, like furniture shifting in a sleeping house. The dragon, she thought, the dragon, and still it jolted her to think it breathed in, breathed out. She heard it. She felt it in her bones. "Please," Theon said again, rasping. She did not know to whom he addressed it. Perhaps to himself. Perhaps to the thing. "Please don't tell him. Don't let him. If he finds." She looked at Theon with some weariness and some tenderness and saw that he was, despite everything, still a man who cared what happened to a secret. He had kept his own so long he had become it. Pity was a luxury, her old self would have said. But she had starved enough to know that a small crust sometimes kept a soul alive. "I won't tell him," she said. "I won't tell anyone." That was an unwise promise. Wisdom asked that one call others to witness what was impossible to guard alone. But this was not a thing she could hand to the men who warmed their hands at Ramsay's hearth, to the lordlings from the south with their fry noses and their anxieties about meat. This was a thing out of songs, and her house had once had songs of its own. She would keep it until keeping became more dangerous than revealing. She drew back from the ridge at last. The thing did not move again in any way she could swear to, but she felt its attention leave her and go back to itself, to its own deep calculus. She rose unsteadily. Theon pushed himself up from his knees by bracing a hand against the odd-melted rock and looked at her like a dog that has decided not to bite and hopes you will not strike. He had asked her not to go in, and she had gone in. He had asked her not to tell, and she had promised not to. He would walk the edge of that. Then, as he walked the edge of everything, because he had learned that there was no ground under anything now, that everything flexed like a frozen lake under a new crack. They wriggled back through the crack in the stones. In the corridor, the damp felt ordinary again. Sansa stopped long enough to pull her hood up and listen to that breath, which was once more what it had been, an intimation rather than a sound. It did not occur to her to cross herself with 7 fingers or whisper an old prayer. She laid her palm against the wall and whispered, "I won't tell." The stone was only stone under her hand now. They returned above to their appointed rooms, and the day. Sailors and maids brought gossip as they always had. The heat put men in poor humor. They said it was unnatural that the floors could be warm when the air outside bit like a wolf. Ramsay came in laughing with his hair gathered by the hood of his cloak into a shape like a cock's comb and asked whose dog had pissed in the passage. Sansa took her food with both hands and ate the way she had learned to eat when she had to, because eating is a thing you control when you control nothing else. Theon said as little as possible. She dreamed of fire that night, not roaring, not a language of flames such as she had glimpsed once on a shore when a priest had set a thing to burn. This fire spoke slower. It said, "I have been here longer than your father's father's father." It said, "I do not belong to you, but you belong to me because you stand above me, above my breath, and walk your small walks and make your small plans." It said nothing at all, really, in any tongue that men used, and yet she woke with its words in her mouth. On the wall, where the wind took the nose of a man and left him with a raw face and a rash of indignities, Jon climbed to the top of the steps and looked where the sky looked hardest. He held his cloak closed with one fist and did not think of Winterfell as a tactic. Men had asked him to be a tactic every day. He had learned his noggin that way, from the old bear and from men who had survived the cold because their minds had a keel, but he had been a boy at Winterfell who had stood by the window and looked to where the smoke from the smithy made a soft dome, and that boy lived stubborn as a burr. Ghost lay with his head on Jon's boot and breathed the kind of quiet that made other quiets seem false. They had done their rounds. Men nodded to him when he passed, some with respect, some with calculation, a few with the mortal reverence reserved for other men's mythology. He did not let it settle on him. He had work. He had letters. One letter waited among the rest, a common thing, sealed with cheap wax. Jon turned it in his fingers. The hand was not one he recognized. The name on the front was not his name, but a boy's name he had not used since he had taken a new office and been forced to swear a thing that had turned from a line in his mouth into a weight on his back. Nonetheless, it had found him. He carried the letters inside where the wind could not pluck at their edges. He lit a candle. The wax sputtered a little. The cold made sullen every small flame. Ghost put his muzzle under Jon's hand in a way that said that this ritual had occurred often enough that the wolf considered himself part of it. Jon flattened the page and read. The letter came from a man who signed himself with a Tidewater N. Aim and called himself a tanner out of Torrens Square. He wrote in a careful, cramped hand that had been taught him by a septon or a patient wife. He put down the news that someone had told him would matter to a stark-blooded man. That the old places were waking. He did not say dragon. He had never seen a dragon. He said heat. He said the steam was thicker in the dungeons than it had been, and men spoke of a breath that was not the breath of living men. The floor had bucked a little under the dogs in the kennel. The hounds had whined the way they whine at thunder. He wrote this not from any love of the Starks. He had not dared to write of love, but because he had traded skins to men in the winter town who had been raised on Stark bread, and it had done him good, and when a thing does you good for a long time and is taken away, a man feels that habit leave a dent. He wrote because his hand and his pen were the only weapons he had to set against the men in the castle who had dogs and iron. Jon turned the paper over and ran his thumb over the cheap wax. He knew better than to give his heart to rumor. He had been trained in rumor as if it were an enemy. He said the words, what words? Not out loud, and looked at Ghost, and Ghost's eyes were an answer that was not logic. The dire wolf lifted his head, sniffed the air as if a smell might come over ice and stone, and laid his head down again with a kind of resolved sorrow. There were other letters. One from a lord in name and a usurer in practice at White Harbor, couched in polite phrases and salted with courtesies that would not be answered. One from a man he had used for a scout, who wrote bluntly about movement among the dead and what he considered worse, movement among the living who had cut pacts with the dead in winter-silly ways. John answered each letter as a lord would answer. He wrote with the caution and gravity he put on each day, like mail. He sealed each and handed them to a boy to run down the steps, and when the boy had gone and the room was hollow, he set his palm on the cheap paper from Torrens Square and let the heat of his hand creep into it. Nonsense, of course. Winterfell had always been warm, but what do men mean when they say always 8 years? 800? He had not thought of the warmth as a thing with varieties. It had been the hum in the floor to him, the heat that loosened muscles before a boy went to swing at a post with a blunted sword. He had never wondered where it had derived from, because little boys do not ask why their mother's milk is warm. They drink. He took Ghost and went to the yard. Men were sparring there, and their breath rose like ghosts. He walked the perimeter and listened for the wall's song. The brittle chime of rhyme, the thump of a body against frozen wood, the scratch of leather. Beneath it something else sang to him, his own blood or the idea of Stark blood, or some other thing that used him and would use him as long as it could because men are tools for the old currents. He cleared his throat as if he could dislodge the fear that he was making stories out of winter because he was tired, because all the living had become either a ledger or a funeral. When he slept that night, he dreamed what, he told himself in the morning, men might dream who had run the Winterfell yard in high summer. He dreamed heat rising through stone. He dreamed a white root growing straight down into warm earth and finding there not dirt but heat, finding there a heart that was not a heart, a thing that beat through the ground and made a sound that was like his mother singing a song he had no memory to attach to any face. He woke with his throat tight and Ghost's nose on his mouth, and he pushed the animal gently away and said the little curse to untangle whatever skein had caught him. In White Harbor, Wyman Manderly's fingers were a poem of plumpness and stains. He sat in his chair, which was loyal to his shape by long habit, and played a game with a board inlaid with whale bone in which pieces shaped like ships moved against pieces shaped like wolves. It was a private game. He did not permit his courtiers to call it that. If anyone were admitted to the room while he sat with his board and his musings, he would move the pieces to the shadowed portion and rest his hand over them and talk of grain and wharfage. He had learned that a fat man's life depended on his ability to persuade men that he was thinking only of his belly while he thought of their throats. He had heard a thing. He had heard it from a man whose name he had celebrated publicly because he had welcomed him back from some near peril, and whose wife cried into her apron when the Lord spoke his name like a bread had been kneaded to a feast. He had heard it from a laundress who'd given a boy a kiss and been given in return a secret because the boy wanted to put his lips to some use that made sense of his own fear. He had heard it from a drunk, and he had ignored the drunk because the drunk had insisted it was the voice of the seven under the earth and had tried to sell the voice to the Lord for a gold stag. He had heard it, and he had sat in his chair and closed his eyes and put his forefinger on the ship, and moved it one square closer to the wolves, knowing that men in the far castles moved, blind to one another and thinking themselves captains and not pieces. "Send salt pork," he told his man, who stood with a paper, "to the farmhouse by the weir on the yellow mill stream." "There is no farmhouse at the weir, my lord." "No," Manderly said softly, "but there will be those who will say there is. You send it, and you write that it was taken by men under Winterfell who claimed the name Stark. The paper you read to me will read that it was taken by bandits, and the paper you will carry will bear a private note that says that if bandits take meat at a pattern, they are something else." He licked his thumb and moved the ship another square. "Send barley. Easier to carry, harder to count. Send it to the wrong place so that it can course its way into the right one. And if anyone asks what interests me about bandits, you tell them I am an old man who hates randomness and thinks the world should line up like a tidy meal." The man bowed and left. Manderly cracked his knuckles and stared at the wolves. He had a sense for his city as a butcher has for his block. He knew where the meat had been, where it had bled out, where the muscle ran. He had been hungry once. He remembered what hunger made a man clever about. He had been banqueting for a long time now, and he did not mistake appetite for that old knowledge. He craved only this, the balance restored. He had learned to keep that craving polite and to feed it with small, invisible acts. If the breath under Winterfell was a thing and not a tale, and he believed that nothing lasted so long unless it had a thing at the bottom of it. He would feed it. He would feed it with food and with news. Men lock their doors against starving dogs and set a bowl sideways out, thinking themselves better than they are for that act. He would do as much for the breath. And he would tell no one, for telling was the work of those who wanted credit, and he knew well the way credit took the power from a thing and made it a decoration. Sansa did not return to the Hollow for 3 days. She did not for a variety of reasons that would have satisfied any interrogation. The men were drinking and loud. It was not wise to be seen walking too often and alone. The air outside was so sharp it bit through the cracks and made her teeth hurt, and she felt as if she were already scalded from the steam within. The truest reason was more simple. She walked around the knowledge as one walks around a pond whose ice is questionable. It looked pretty. It reflected the sky. It had sled her childhood like a miracle. It could crack and make an end of a person's life without any malice at all. She sat in her room and mended a tear in her stocking and pricked her finger and put the pricked finger to her mouth and tasted her own blood. She thought of the orange light and the color for which she had not had the word. She thought of calling to it the way one calls to a cat, foolishly, tenderly, knowing that the cat will do as it pleases and that one calls not for effect but for one's own sake. On the third night she went. Theon was in the corridor when she left her room. She had not asked him to be. He had made himself a thing that watched. He looked up when she opened the door with that not-cat gaze of his, wary and hungry without being food-hungry. "If you go again," he said, "take me." "Do you wish to go?" she asked. "No," he said, and the truth of it rang in him like a bell. "But if something happens to you while I stand and do nothing, you think him will do something worse than he might otherwise do. I think he will do what he will, and I think there is more to me than what I am when I am apart from you, my lady, and I prefer to be what I am when I stand with you to what I am when I stand alone." He smiled a little at the strangeness of voicing it. "That is all I have." They went. They did not bring a light, for the reason that it marked the bearer like a banner. Sansa had thought that the Hollow would be different when one came to it twice. Things shift when they are known. They alter shape, they become less or more because they have been looked at. Some of the old fear had ebbed, the fear that inked the edges of things when one walked into them for the first time, but the awe had not. The spring breathed, the air folded around them. Once more she touched the ridge. This time the contact hurt a little, as if she had put her hand to a harp string and it had sung back with more power than her finger had expected. The sound drew blood to her palm. The dragon stirred. She could make a story out of it that would find its path to the endpoints men loved because they knew them already. That she spoke a word and it answered. That it lifted its great head and looked her in the face with an eye like a coin of old gold. That it knew her name because it had known her fathers and had slept under their feet to be called by one like her. None of that was so. It moved as slowly as trees move. The slope of its ridge lifted and lowered so that the skin beneath her hand slid and caught her palm. The smell that had come to her before rose again. Iron and old salt and a fainter thing like stone wetted after a long drought. It did not open its eye, not in any way that she could name as an eye. It remained a shape that was both part of the room and not, as if the earth had curled itself into an animal and gone to sleep a long time ago and had no desire, yet to wake. Theon had found the strength not to fall to his knees this time. He stood and watched and looked as if he had set his eyes on something he had done and knew what it had been without flattery and without the small lies that keep a man upright. Sansa said his name softly because she did not want to be alone in the contact and also because she wanted to be an echo to something larger than herself. "Don't ask me what it is," he said, his voice flat. "I want to say the word, and if I say it, some part of me will go over to the men who drank in halls that are no longer ours and told stories. I don't want to go over. I want to stay here in the gaps and the cracks, because this is ours and not theirs." She did not press him. She had learned when a man had given all he had, and asking for another coin would be theft. She stood and let the heat slip into the blood vessels of her hand and up into her arm. It was not comfortable. It was not pain. It was the sensation of entering water that is too hot for what you think you are and discovering that you can bear more than you thought if you simply make your breath agree to the terms. She closed her eyes for a moment and saw in the skin. under her lids that color again, like iron with a heart. The room gave the smallest creak. A drop of water fell from the lip of the spring and sounded weirdly loud when it hit the pool below. Sansa said, again without meaning to speak, "Do you know me?" There was no answer. There was a thing like a presence and no more than the bare sense that breath does not waste itself on names. She drew her hand away, and when the air caught it, it felt colder than it had been. She did not shake it out. She held it to her chest. "We should feed it," Theon said. He was so surprised by himself when he said that he laughed, and the laugh broke like something cracked and dry. "Listen to me now. I stand with a lady under the castle and talk about feeding a thing. Men will say we have taken leave of our wits." She thought of Manderley. She did not know his name with an intimacy yet, not the intimacy of a man who sits at your table and salts the meat, but she thought of the way news moved toward loyalty, the way a river seeks low ground. "We must be careful. We must be careful," he agreed, and they laughed again, the kind of laugh you do in church when a priest says something that tickles and you cannot help yourself. And then they were both quiet, ashamed of having tried to make a sound to cover the larger sound in the room. They did not bring food that night. They thought of the problem of bringing food, and Theon's head tilted with the alertness of a man who had run raids and knew where to find fish where others saw only ice. "There is meat enough in this castle," he said. "There is meat in the kennels. There is meat in the guardroom. There is meat on tables that go cold because men stagger away full and leave bones to dogs." "We will be seen," she said. "We are always seen," he said. "We have to learn to be seen as what we wish to be seen as, not as what we are. This I know." The next day, Winterfell cracked. The crack was not what one would call violent. Men heard it and said later that it had been like the sound of a knot in a Yule log giving way all at once in a blaze. It made men look up and laugh and say that the old place had found a new old bone to settle. In the kennel, the dogs set up a brief, high chorus, then quieted, as if a hand had smoothed every ear at once. In the kitchens, a pot of stew shivered, and a cook swore because his polish of scum felt spoiled. In the great hall, a fry said, "What was that?" And no one bothered to answer him. In Sansa's room, a hairline fissure ran like a drawn knife through the plaster at the top corner, and a powdering of white dust sprinkled her table. She was too used to keeping her face smooth for other reasons to start at the dusting. She pinched her lips and went to the door with a tray in her hand like she were a maid and not a lady. Theon met her before she had fully cleared the threshold. His gaze flicked to the crack as if he had eyes in his temples and then back to her face, and they nodded each other like conspirators who had conspired only in their bones. It seemed also to shake the gods would, whether because it shook the ground or because the gods have their own senses about insult. The pool made no ripple by which to tell that the earth had shifted. The weirwood did not shed bark or leaf like a thread. But the tree looked at those who looked at it with a broader, simpler patience, as if the patience of a tree can say, "I will be here regardless." Ramsay went through the godswood that afternoon with 2 of his men and a hound at heel to see if a certain bolt cracked, because he liked to put bolts in things and then inspect them for failure, to confirm his faith that everything failed. He smiled at the weirwood with his empty smile and said, "Did you move?" The weirwood kept the secrets of old blood better than Sansa ever had. In his little room at the top of the wall, Jon turned his head as if a hand had brushed his hair. He could not have told you what he had heard. If anyone had asked him, he would have called himself a fool for answering honestly and said he had heard Winterfell sigh. He did not tell anyone. He made a note to himself on a scrap of paper, which he would have been embarrassed to show any man he respected, and he wrote beside it 3 words that felt childish and right: "Watch the ravens." He had already told the ravens to go because he had trained himself to know when information wanted to move. They came and perched on the sill and looked at him with the dislike of unshy birds. He told them nothing. He would have been mad to. He sent them to the maesters they were supposed to go to, and to an old woman who kept the small gods, would near the gift and called herself nothing but aunt, and to a man he called only harborer. He did not include on any piece of paper the words that were the engine of his sending. He thought them, and it seemed to him that thinking sometimes had its own right. Bran dreamed the castle as if he were looking down at his toys, that had started after cold and hunger, had knocked holes in him, and older magics had poured in. He did not always welcome those dreams. They were as often scoldings as gifts. This time the castle spread like a spill of cards across a table. It drew focus, this was new, toward a place he had not looked much at as a child because it had been merely there. The dark below the dark, the crypts. He saw the row of kings arranged like a lesson in quiet. He saw the stone wolves with their tongues cut in the shape that had meant power to men who had needed the symbol. He saw a fissure. He saw steam rising from the fissure in a thread like the line a woman draws on parchment with the hand of a scribe. He saw, beneath that, the line of white root from the weirwood descending, down and down and down, as if the tree were a needle and the root its thread. He saw it touch something that was not earth. Not touch. It didn't dare touch. It hung over it the way a mother hangs over a cradle. He drew nearer in the way one draws nearer in a dream by thinking near. The thing beneath had the shape of a hill curled upon itself, but when his mind adjusted, he saw that it was the shape of a creature that had made itself into a hill. He did not name it. Naming in dreams had taught him humility, for names had a way of waking up and asking for meaning. He wanted to awaken nothing, and at the same time he wanted to strike the ground with a staff and say, "Wake." He felt young and very old at once. He felt himself in the root. He felt the force that ran from the tree to the thing beneath the castle as an ache in his bone that never mended properly. He thought of his father, and of his father's father, and of the line that lived in the stone, and of the way that line had been broken by the arrogance of men who had called themselves lords in rooms that did not know their names. He thought a thought that would have made him ridiculous to the ragged boy he had been when he left the castle behind, and the thought was this: perhaps the old gods had put the thing there and put the tree there to keep it company and to tell it when to wake or when not to wake. He was a boy who had learned cruelty from the sky and dispassion from the wood. He felt tenderness for the thing beneath the castle in the same shiver as you are a weapon. He woke with his mouth dry. Mira was stirring the pot. Jojen coughed. The world was crowded with small needs. He did not speak of it. He learned, after hunger and frostbite, that you do not offer the world your every vision. You keep some for the moment when a kept thing makes a difference. Theon stole half a ham. He did it with the skill of a boy who had once run in halls that were not his and learned where the corners caught the shadows and where a man could lean and become part of the furniture. The head cook had a ledger in his mind and would have seen a whole ham vanish even if he had been drunk. But half a ham could be explained as hunger's righteous theft. Half a ham could be blamed upon rats the size of dogs and lush jokes. Theon tucked the piece under his cloak and walked not too quickly and not too slow. His mouth set in the particular quirk that says, "I am about the business I am about, and no one has any cause to question me." He went down the corridor, turned left where he had turned right before so that anyone who had seen him would not think him repeating himself and so would not mark a pattern. He fit himself through the crack again and breathed the steam as if it were absolution, and Sansa followed with the careful step of a woman who had practiced being unremarkable long enough that it had become a craft. They laid the meat upon the floor near the ridge. They did not push the meat against the thing. That would have been worse than bold. That would have been like laying a crown upon a man's brow who had not asked for it and had not reached the day when the weight fit him. They laid it near and then waited and discovered that waiting in heat is different from waiting in cold. In cold you can blame the lack of sensation for time's slowness. In heat you feel each heartbeat and it stretches. The meat lay. Steam rose. Sansa closed her eyes for a count of 100 and opened them, and in that time she felt the urge to snatch the meat back and hide it in her cloak, because what if this were an insult? What if this were a bribe, and bribes are for lesser things? Theon's eyes had gone wide the way a boy's go in a woods when he sees a bear track. Time passed. Something changed. The change was not visible. They learned that the first changes never are. There was a sensation of attention. Then there was a smell. Something between old cave and fresh broken bone. Then, at last, the smallest shift of the air in the room without the door opening, as if a large body had drawn breath and by drawing made the currents alter. And then the ham was not where it had been. It was simply not. No movement. No lunge of any limb. No tongue, for they did not see a tongue. No mouth. One moment meat. The next, a place on the floor scuffed with it. grease a sheen like a prayer on the stone. Steam twisted oddly where heat had been spilled into it. Sansa scared herself by laughing. The laugh was joyous and bent in the middle and almost sobbed. Theon put a hand out for balance. He hit the wall with it and flinched and bit down on the sound. And Sansa looked at the wall with anger she had not labored to tame. For the wall had become the nearest thing to the men who had made him jump. "Do you see?" she whispered. "Do you see?" He saw. He did not let his face make a word like happiness. He did not remember that shape. His mouth softened around a place where a smile might have been, and he nodded. "Yes," he said with painful gravity. "Yes." Outside the hollow, actions became a little satisfying. Theon paid a boy to put meat to a certain door and say that he had done it because a guard had told him. He paid him with the last coin he had not stolen or been given, and he watched the boy weighed by the coin and by the weight of a command that he could not place but felt. Sansa walked to the glass gardens with a face that was her father's when he had been thinking of the justice of a case. She kept her hands within her gloves even though the plants inside the glass lapped at the air like tongues, green and eager to be touched. She said in her mind, "One thing, mine." It had been long since she had set a claim. She had learned to avoid pronouns of possession because the men who would take notice them like hawks notice field mice. Now she wanted a word. She would not say it aloud. She let it send its small roots under her tongue, tasted it when she swallowed. Ramsay saw her in the garden and cocked his head at her, as if she were a piece of music he did not understand and thus disliked. He sauntered over, fingers tucked into his belt, as if he had the leisure a lord has when a hall is well stocked. "Ked and every enemy is licked. What does the lady think she's looking at?" he said in a tone that would have been soft if not for the splinters in it. "Cress," she said truthfully, looking at Cress. "Lettuces, the stench of rot in the far row. Whoever steams the glass in the morning is incompetent." She did not hide the scorn in her voice, and because her scorn struck nowhere that mattered to him, he liked it. He liked any expression like a dog likes the small attentions that are not a blow. "You busy yourself with women's things," he said, with that old easy cruelty that had been told to him before he could form letters. She turned her face to him and let it be placid. "I busy myself with Winterfell's things." The word did not stick in her mouth as it ought to have if she had meant to be safe. She watched him bring into focus the portion of the phrase that interested him. He did not catch the other portion. He preened a little like a child who has been expertly fed praise. "Winterfell's things," he repeated. "A true wife." She lowered her head. He put his fingers under her chin and lifted her head to look into her eyes. He liked that. He liked the ownership of any gesture that made his blood feel big. She let him see nothing under the words, nothing the breath would have warmed. He released her with a little shove that he meant to be playful and went away. When he was gone, she sat down on a bench and put her hands on the warm stone seat and said, "To the steam and the glass. You are ours and not his. You have always been ours." The guard shift went on. Men played dice. Men muttered. One man fell asleep and scared himself awake and covered it with a cough. Theon went about a task he had been set because he had learned to do tasks without letting their shape get into him. He did the task and also counted steps. He was good now at counting. He counted breath sometimes. If you can count breath when a man is laughing at you, you live. If you can count breaths when you steal ham for a thing under the castle that might or might not be a beast from a story, you become again a thing whose breath is his own. There was a fight in the yard that night between two men, one of whom had called the other a word men use concerning mothers when men's sense of themselves is too small to sustain an insult about their own persons. The knife that came out was not meant for the gut. It was meant for the wrist, the small cuts that make a man ashamed to use his sword again because the scar shows the shape of his cowardice to him every time he looks at it. Blood came all the same. The wrist is a lively river. The men around them moved, then did not. These were not the fights you break up. The loser made a sound like a man whose first child has been born in a cold room. They dragged him inside. Sansa watched the smear on the packed snow. She went to the window and stood with her fingers on the edge of the stone and thought. Soon, she and Theon fed the hollow again. A haunch from a haunch. Bones went where bones go. Flesh went where flesh goes. The room breathed and grew a fraction of a degree warmer, as if the thing within had uncurled a sliver and converted the meat into some other form that was not growth, not yet, but was preparation. Sansa learned to move her hand along the skin of it in the same way one moves one's hand on a horse to say easy. Theon learned to stand straighter. They did not speak of plans. Plans break when you name them too soon. They did not speak of the word north or of the words take back. But those words lived like seedlings in a trough by their bed and grew without anyone watching because such things do. Then, in a morning when frost had drawn patterns on the tower glass like leaves of some eastern tree, there came to Winterfell another letter. It came with a seal unremarkable and a messenger forgettable, and if it had gone to Ramsay's hand first, the shape of everything might have altered for the worse. It went to the maester, whose name was Tybald and whose hands trembled when he lifted a spoon because the nerve had got a tremor in it after he had sat too long beside a dying man. He read the letter. His eyes grew wet and not precisely with tears. He excused himself with dignity from the hall where he had been asked to read from the old history that made men feel themselves part of something because the words were much older than their own. He walked to the little room he used for writing and rereading and men's needs. He set the letter on the table and put his hands beside it and said, "Oh." The letter said little. Its value was not in the words. The parchment smelled of wood smoke from another place. It said that a girl had been seen not far from a long-abandoned mill, wanting a ride, wrapped in a cloak whose color the writer could not be certain of because the light had been wrong. It said that the girl had looked like a Stark in the way that common men learn to describe a look as a thing with a jaw and a quiet in it, and that she had spoken a name and been angry when she spoke it. The name was not Sansa. It was another. The maester sat down. He had lived long enough to know that messages often had twins. He dug into the drawer where he kept the letters that had come into his keeping and not been read to the one who had bidden him manage such business, whether because a man with a higher name had said hush or because his own old conscience had looked at a thing and said, not yet. He found among them two with no particular scent that, read together, made something more than soldiers' gossip. A boy who had seen a white wolf as big as a pony in the snow near a stand of pines that had been a landmark since the days when trees themselves had names. A washerwoman who had watched a man and a woman take meat in the wrong direction for men who were living above and guard wild dogs. He was an old man who had learned caution. He was an old man who had known a boy who had come with his father to the rookery and had wanted more than bread and had given him, with unwisdom but great kindness, a handful of raisins and said, "Keep this our secret." The boy had been named Rob. He folded both hands over his belly and closed his eyes. He wrote a letter then. He wrote it to no one. He wrote in a hand no one would recognize, one he had taught himself by writing out lists of herbs in a childish style when he feared his own handwriting would betray him. He wrote one line, "The old is waking to the old." He wrote another line, "If you are a Stark, you have a right to come to the gate unmarked." Then he burned the letter and flicked the ashes out his narrow window and put his face in his hands and did not weep because weeping was a privilege and he had given himself no privileges for many years. The word north traveled. It did not travel with drums. It traveled in the breath of men who warmed their hands over a triangle of sticks. It traveled in the way women looked at their sons and laid a hand on the brow as if measuring the fever of restlessness there. Up by the shadow of a hill called the King's Bed for no good reason but a story, a girl with a coin sewn into her hem turned a certain way where no one would see, and came to a place where a man kept a horse who had once been called a war horse and now was called by the name dogs are given when they are old and lazy, Hob. She kissed Hob's nose and called him useless, and he looked at her with the mild affronted kindness of a beast who knows both its use and its limits. She had dreamed of Winterfell not as a place of heat but as a stone song. She set her cheek to the horse's shoulder and listened. The stone song came under the ground to her and rubbed its cheek against her own, and she said, "All right," and mounted and rode. Sansa went to the hollow alone that night. Theon had been set a task he could not evade, and she did not like to take this thing by herself. But the pull had grown and she had learned that some calls must be answered with the full strength of your foolishness if you wish to be the kind of person who can do anything at all later. She carried under her arm meat that she had bartered from the cook with nothing but a look that said, "You do not want to ask me why I want this. and the cook, who had known noble houses long enough to recognize when to mind his blood pressure and go on peeling onions, had kept his mouth. She slid through the crack and went into the belly. She could not, afterward, say whether the room changed or she had. The steam rolled. The spring spoke to itself. The ridge lay. She set the meat down and did not speak. She put her hand on the hide, and the hide was not hide. The iron warmth took her and took some of her fear with it and replaced it with another that sat better in the heart. Fear that refreshes like cold water, not fear that kills like a hand on the neck. She stayed there a long time, hand to ridge, body swaying with the breath, as if they were women in a red tent. When she took her hand away, she became aware of a new thing. The ridge showed a crack the length of her palm. It was not a wound. The colors under it were not the color of blood. And as she watched, smoke the color of candle soot seeped out and tasted the air and smelled of bone and pine and something that made her think, wildly, of the day she had watched her father put his hand to the new foal's flank to steady it. She put her hand near the crack, and the smoke moved like a tame thing toward her palm and clung a moment to it before it broke and went into the room. She nearly lifted her hand to her mouth, childish, foolish, to lick the taste of it, but did not, because some lines once crossed cannot be crossed again, and she was not ready to cross anything more. She had crossed enough these 2 years. She went out. The corridor felt like a throat she had come through. The castle above seemed to her that night more clearly itself than it had in any night before. She saw which stones were set by which men, which sconces had been hammered by which smiths, which grooves in the stair had been made by her father's boots and which by other men. She saw where a crack had come newly in the last frost. She saw the little thumbprint in the mortar beside her door where a mason had leaned his hand long ago. She slept and dreamed nothing and woke with a desire that was not hunger for food and not hunger for safety, but for execution. The impulse inside a person that says, move. On the next day, the ravens came to the rookery as if the sky had shaken their strings. They knocked until the boy yoked to that duty, a lad with a nose red from eternities of cold and a soul of patient toastiness, had to swat at them to keep his fingers from being nipped. He brought the maester what they carried. The maester did what had taken him a lifetime to refine into a craft. He separated the wheat from the chaff, and then later in the afternoon he separated the chaff from the chaff-seeming wheat. He set one letter aside for the hands of the man who presumed to call himself lord of the castle now, because those hands had to see something to keep from groping elsewhere. He set another letter aside for the girl who could not be given anything openly because openness to her was like acid to cloth. He set another aside for himself because old men have their private stores of useless things, and sometimes later those things become useful by a miracle that is no miracle at all but the patient work of connections. Sansa had learned to take from the maester what he left where she would find it. This had been a practice begun without words, as the best practices are. Sometimes what he left was a book with a ribbon placed in a chapter that had no merriment in it but contained, dry as oaten bread, a crumb of information realer than any sermon. Sometimes it was a lemon. Sometimes it was nothing, and the nothing was information too. That day it was a scrap. She found tea tucked under the cushion of the bench in the glass garden where she sat in the afternoon as if she cared to mend the leaf of a cabbage. She slid her hand under and felt the dry whisper of paper and bent her head as if she were smelling green, and drew the paper up under the nubbly edge of her glove and did not look at it until she was alone. Then she looked, and the words were few. Ride. She could not yet. This was the only answer in her, so she thought the impossible thought that has saved more houses than swords have. If I cannot, who can? Theon's back, when he stripped to wash in water that steamed thinly, showed a geography of a certain man's style. Sansa had learned to look without letting her eyes be seen. This is the only way to look at pain that has been made into a relief map upon a person. She put her eyes on the wall instead. He folded his shirt over a chair with care. He thought aloud, now and then, in the fashion of a man who spent so long saying nothing he had nearly forgotten that words could be used to measure distance and not only to mark compliance. There are tunnels, he said. Men forget tunnels because they live above ground. But I learned tunnels in Pike before I ever knew Winterfell. The North remembers that men are sometimes moles. Some of them are stopped. Some of them go somewhere. I can find them. Do not be found finding them, she said. He smiled. It was a small, contestless thing. "Oh, I am good at not being found." For 3 days he was gone at hours that made Sansa feel like the small self she had put aside had climbed back into her skin. She lay awake and listened to the breath under the floors and told herself stories about Theon in the tunnels that ended with him coming back. And then when she could not sleep, she changed the story and had the end be that he did not come back. And she watched how her mind tried to make too much of her and correct things that were not for her to correct. She learned the habit of catching her mind at that work and setting it down gently as one sets down a puppy with a slipper, before love and exasperation turn into a smack and shame. He returned. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her and nodded once. "Men have said more with less. I can get us from the belly to the snow," he said. "From there, the snow will be the snow. We will find the rest by freezing where we need to and running when we can." "The girl," Sansa said. The paper had said Ride. It had not added a name. It had not needed to. "We must take her." "She is not here," Theon said, and Sansa's insides clutched not with surprise. Surprise was a thing for people whose lives ran on rails, but with the cold that comes when a plan which had not yet had the right to be called a plan has already been overtaken by change. "Where?" she asked. "South," he said. "Not far. A day? Less. She has friends on no horse. She has herself." It was a measure of what Theon had become that he did not say a name. He had learned that a name in a mouth can become an accusation when heard by the wrong ear. She pictured Arya because the mind wants to put familiar faces on hopes, but the letter had not said Arya, and Sansa had learned not to invest in ghosts. A girl had been seen. It was enough. "We get her," Theon said, his jaw out. "Or we get as near to getting as we can and then we try again. But not yet. You are not ready. The thing under the castle is not ready. The world is not ready." He laughed without mirth. "I say this like I command time. I say this like time is a servant." She felt, then, what she had not allowed herself. The impatience of a heart that has found a weapon and wants to swing it. She put her hands on the stone of the windowsill and let the stone take some of that out of her. She leaned her forehead against the edge and let the cool find its way into her skull. "We feed it again," she said. "They fed it. They fed it as if feeding had been a prayer it understood. They brought not only meat. Sansa brought skin and hair, because she had learned that animals find value where humans find disgust. She brought hoof incidental to a butchering. She brought the old gristle a man had left on a plate. Theon brought the marrow bones that had been meant for a stew and had not been used because a lord had taken his meal with a whore and no one had wished to set him before the fire with a bowl and a spoon, lest he call for a dog's bowl and make a clownery of it. The thing took what it took. The room altered. The crack lengthened. A sound came that had not come before. A click from inside the ridge, faint as a fingernail on a stone bowl. Sansa startled at that and thought, not for the first time, of the stories of dragons in the south that men had told as if hearing them kept them safe from danger. Those stories had teeth of a sort. The teeth were in the way they shaped a person's expectation. She did not want her expectations shaped by men who had watched queens with silver hair step out of their baths and had confused the queen with the nature of the thing she purported to own by blood. The North had its own magic. The North did not do pageants. If the thing under Winterfell woke, she did not want to dress it in a cloak it would only tear. A storm came and set the wind to hollowing around the towers and made the dogs wild. Men battened shutters and cursed the more because they were warm at the feet. The breath under the floors rose thicker. It made men uncomfortable, and they relished their discomfort the way men do when they know they are blessed compared to others but wish to be permitted to complain. Sansa took that weather into herself and let it be a thing she could ride. In the hollow, the steam took on a new whirl, circling a point over the crack as if a finger were drawing symbols in incense. Sansa felt dizzy once standing there and had to sit hard on her heels. Theon gripped her shoulder to steady her, and his hand was strong enough again to do that. She felt a surge of pride unspool in her. It was not for him, though it was also for him. It was for the thing that the world does when you tend it, when your tending is not sentimental but exact. She slipped the meat into that new whirl. The meat vanished again without motion she could track. She pressed both palms to the ridge and imagined, for her own comfort, that the hide of it warmed under her customary touch. She imagined that she had done something and not only been witness to the inevitable waking of the old. Power is a kind of hunger. She took care not to feed it the wrong dish. There came to the gate a rider with a hood pulled up and a horse flecked with sorrel. The rider asked no welcome. The rider asked water. The rider drank. The rider pushed the hood back and showed a face Sansa had not permitted herself to attach to her hope for a long time. She looked once and once again for the sake of certainty, and then did not look a third time because the third look would have been too much and she would have shown her throat. She turned to the wall and made a show of smoothing her glove, and in the smoothness her breath faltered and steadied. The rider's name, when asked, was one the North had not said aloud for years. The North did not say names of the dead easily. The guard at the gate laughed awkwardly and said the line he had been taught to say for men who spoke words too important for his mouth to own. Any man can call himself king under a hedge. Any girl can call herself a Stark. Have you a token? The girl put her hand inside her cloak and brought forth a trifling object that would have meant nothing to anyone who did not know the Stark household. To Sansa it was a blade of grass from the center of her chest. She turned a little and looked over her shoulder and down because she did not dare keep her eyes on that object. She would have flown. The guard took it, puzzled, and said, "All right then." Not because he understood, but because the king who kept his head only sometimes was in residence, and the guard had discovered that it was better to allow the world to have what it wanted than to tell it no and be made into a lesson. They brought the girl into the yard. Her bones showed themselves through her clothing like the frame of a building whose walls have been stripped for the winter wind. She moved with a looseness in the hips that said she had learned to ride far and long on not enough food. She looked around with eyes that had emptied themselves of the world to spare themselves the work of processing too much. She saw Sansa. Sansa saw her. Sansa did not move. The girl did not move. They stood like two trees who had long grown apart and had been put back together in a narrative particularly dear to men who think trees exist to frame their stories. Sansa did not weep. The girl did not smile. "We have to do this as if this is not dangerous," Sansa said, and crossed the yard with steps she had learned in King's Landing and the vale where a lady's walking is armor. The girl let Sansa touch her elbow very lightly. "I heard the ground," she said. Her voice was sanded down. "It told me to go home." "Good," Sansa said. "Good." They put her in a room, and a woman came to take her garments with a briskness that said she had always been in the employ of noble households, even when she had been a girl, and her first job had been setting tripe to rinse. The woman clucked. The cluck women have that is not pity but better than pity. Competence. She heated water and set it to steam in a basin and said nothing foolish or overly sweet. The girl sat and held her bones the way one holds bones to prevent them from falling out through the skin. Sansa fumbled a moment with a ribbon and then did it properly and stepped back so as not to crowd. "Do they know?" the girl asked, and Sansa understood her to mean, "Do they know who I am? Do they know what they hold?" "Some," Sansa said. "Not enough." "Good," the girl said. "Then perhaps we are not yet dead." They did not say their names too many times to each other that day because saying a name too often wears the sharp off it, and these two had sharpness left and would need it. They said the names once each, and that was the measure. They set their breaths together. Sansa looked at the girl's hands. Scarred, flexing, with dirt under the nails that had set and would not be pried out by one washing. She thought of the dragon under the stone, and the skin that had not been cleaned for a long time, and the crack that had run, and the smoke that had tasted her palm. She felt the two things, the girl and the under thing, a line inside her like the teeth of a key engaging a lock. "We will go down," she said. "We will go down soon, and you will see it, and we will see if it knows you." And she felt no blasphemy in speaking, as if Winterfell had spirits that chose their people and did not simply receive them. She had come to know that the meaning of the word knows can alter so much you could fit a house in the space of the shift. That night, there were footsteps in the corridor at an hour when footsteps had the decency to be absent. They stopped at a door. They moved again. Sansa lay in the dark and felt the castle draw breath around her. She lay her hand on her stomach and discovered that she could calm herself that way instead of putting a hand to her throat. She had learned too many bad habits of self-soothing in rooms where men listened for them. She let the breath under the floor breathe for her. The footsteps went away. In the morning, The knives of Ramsay's amusement were not directed at anyone in the hall. He had hunted a man who had looked like any other and not the person he had intended to be cruel to. This sometimes released pressure in him like a slow leaking from a bladder. Men ate. Someone spilled stew on a sleeve. The dogs were quiet. Sansa had the luxury of chewing. She took the girl to the hollow with only Theon as their shadow. No other witness could be trusted with this. They passed into the corridor that had learned their bodies and did not betray them. The girl ducked into the crack and let the steam make her look an apparition. Sansa watched the way she put her feet. A dancer's precision crossed with a wolf's caution. They came round the corner of the bubble in the earth, and the ridge lay long as always, and the spring breathed, and the steam wrote its private script. Sansa put her hand to the skin and felt the new small electric click beneath. She smiled because sometimes the world does the thing you beg it to because you have done the preparation and you have offered it meat and a manner and a patience, and not because you are special. "Put your hand," she said, and the girl did without asking. Of course. She had become the creature who touches first and thinks after. This had nearly killed her and had also kept her alive. She pressed her palm flat. The room altered. The spring's rhythm changed fractionally, like a drum moving from march to canter. The girl's eyes opened wide and Sansa saw how green could become something like weapons or like a field. Theon made a sound and choked it off because a man can yearn himself into a hole if he lets too much out of his throat at once. "It knows you," Sansa said, and heard in her own voice the same steadiness she had used all her life when she had come upon a truth and found it both terrible and right. "We will get you a horse. We will get you meat. We will plan." They began then. It did not look like plotting in a play. It looked like 15 small acts taken over 6 days, and then a pause, and then another 15 small acts. Theon having a knife sharpened by a man he liked and paying for it with a word that would be remembered with warmth. Sansa letting the maester see the edge of a note she did not mean him to read and seeing in his eyes the satisfaction that comes when an old man is told he is still useful. The girl going to the yard and fumbling a weapon so that the men would turn away in contempt and not watch when later she did not fumble. It looked like 2 slices of meat put aside at once instead of 1 thick slice once so that the total was no different but the visibility of the act was halved. It looked like a scarf pinned in a particular place and then in another so that a guard who saw it would have to have been taught to read it, and no one had taught this guard. It looked like Sansa turning her face toward a window when a certain raven came to settle on a sill, and then toward the door when it flew again, and in that turning, a small chance was made for a boy to pass with something under his coat that was not his. On the 4th day, the dragon cracked again. This time the sound had enough in it to make men in the hall look up and put their spoons down and listen. It sounded like a knuckle being popped, multiplied by a number that made no sense. The steam rolled thicker into the corridors. Men swore. A man made a sign with 2 fingers he had learned in a brothel as a charm against sterility. The dogs held very still all at once, as if something had stepped into the room that only they could see and they were weighing whether to belly to it or to bark. Ramsay turned his head very slowly and stared at the flagstones by his chair as if he could make the breath under them ashamed of itself. He rose and went out, and men who wanted small evolutions in their day followed at the distance men use when they wished to be seen to attend and not seen to be implicated. He went to the Godswood because to do anything else would have been to admit that the movement came from a particular place. He liked the formlessness of the Godswood. He liked the idea that the old tree could be made to bear witness and could be made to lie. He took a knife and cut a very small strip from the bark where a man's hand would not see it, to test if the thing bled and whether the sight of its blood made him feel larger. The tree did not bleed in red. It did not bleed. He was disappointed, but he did not register the disappointment as any betokening of loyalty. He went back to his hall and the bowing men and the meat. He would not go down. He did not know he was not able to go down. The castle itself had learned his step the way a body learns to reject infection. It arranged an absence for him when he approached the corridors that led to the belly in the same way a mind forgets a word it cannot bear to have in it. He was unaccustomed to being handled. He accepted the absence because he had learned that overseeing everything exhausts a man. He had minions for the work of going down. If something were down there, it would come up soon enough. They always did in his philosophy. All prey rises to ascent eventually. They fed the thing twice that day because it had taken what they gave it so fast it had felt not hunger satisfied but hunger quickened. The crack lengthened. The smoke that seeped held color this time. Theon, whose vocabulary had been built on the language of storms at sea and women's hair and blood, could not have named the exact shade. He said, "It looks like a black paper just turning to ash." And Sansa loved him for that because it was the right image and also because it made the thing not a South's jewel but a hearth's domestic miracle. A thing for a home, not a court. When the thing made the second crack, something like a lid lifted inside it. The steam drew in on itself and then pushed out with force enough to turn Sansa's hair against her cheek, as if someone had rudely breathed at her at close range. She put her hand up to quiet it the way one quiets a dog, palm outward. The sense in the room shifted from sleep to drowsy wakefulness, that moment before a creature decides whether to stretch its limbs or pull the blanket back over its head. The girl, who had once been a child who danced the length of the great hall with a needle in her hand and a look of sea, concentration that had made men hold their breath for fear of breaking it, held her palm parallel with Sansa's without having to be told. She had learned this kind of mirroring in lessons no one would have put their daughter to. Theon did not reach out because his reaching was a trespass always now in his own mind. He held his body very still and concentrated his attention so fiercely that Sansa felt it on her skin the way one feels sunlight through a high window in winter. They heard the eye open. This was ridiculous. There had been no eye, yet the sound was undeniable. It was the sound of a lid that has not opened in a long time and does not wish to make a spectacle of itself. Sansa leaned forward as if to look, then stopped herself as if she had been about to look into the bed of a sleeping child and thought better of leaning over. The dragon did not show them its face. It changed the temperature of the room by a measure that a thermometer would not have recorded and that altered the human calculus. It made Sansa aware of each finger. It made the girl aware of the memory of having been a younger girl in the corridor outside her father's solar, listening to the murmur and then bursting in anyway because fathers you love cannot deny you. It made Theon aware of his breath. He took it and it was his. "Soon," Sansa said, and realized that she was not promising the thing so much as promising herself and her house, as if the words had been trapped under her tongue like some seed a bird had dropped there and had finally cracked and put out a white tongue of root. Where there were soons, there were also nows. The now came in a shape no one would have chosen. A feud between two of the men in the hall that had simmered an hour and then boiled over into a show. Men love shows. They gathered. They watched. They shouted names and sums and made of it a thing to set against boredom. The fight went wrong because both men had meant to bruise and not to kill, and if either has meant but not to, then a kill is nearly certain. The knife slid under a rib with innocent clumsiness. One man made the sound men make when they cannot believe the sliver of their own life has been cut and is sliding out. Blood came up in a fountain's arc. It arced to the ceiling and made a pattern that men drunk could regard with awe and some later make into a coat of arms. The man fell. Quiet fell after the noise. The noise rose again in a different shape. Men shouting for a cloth, for a maester, for a martinet to lay punishment on the man who had done the killing and would care about that more than the life that had gone out. No one had the presence to gather the women and move them away. The dogs, who had been well trained in every way except pity, came with long tongues. A portion of the blood came down from the ceiling in runnels and set itself to the flagstones like a red map and worked its way toward the cracks. Sansa stood in the doorway of the great hall and saw the blood slide like a determined traveler toward the lower corridors and stopped herself from running. It would be unseemly to run toward blood. It would make her a figure, a thing for Ramsay to note and read out loud later, to hold up to the light like glass. She walked, slow, measured. The blood went down. Theon met her by the door to the lower corridor. He was not winded. He had learned to slow his own breath, to make time move differently inside his ribs so that men who wished to use breath as leash could not find purchase. He said nothing. They went. In the hollow, the steam was tinted. They had not realized until then that it had ever been uncolored. Now that color lived in it, they realized its lack and how that had been a kind of anemia. The blood came not in a stream as Sansa had feared, which would have made the hollow an abattoir and debased a thing she wished to keep sacred, but in threads, delicate, inquisitive, like fingers of a stream just freed from a glacier. She stepped back not because the thing offended her, but because she did not wish to put herself between it and what it might want. The threads came to the ridge, and then she saw a movement she could swear to. A tongue, blacker than anything else in that room, with a wetness to it that made her feel as if she had come uninvited on a private act. It touched the stone near the crack, drew along it, pulled in a line of red, disappeared. "I'm sorry," Sansa whispered, ridiculous. What had she to apologize for? But she had the absurd sense that she had brought something too intimate to a place that might prefer to be alone. She made herself stand and watch. She made herself learn the ways of the room when fed blood. This was a knowledge she might one day wish to employ or to avoid, and you cannot work with what you flinch from knowing. The crack widened with a sound like an egg cracking a little. She put her hand out and spread her palm. The girl copied her. The steam came closer, nosed at their hands, curled around their fingers like a cat. Theon stood with his mouth set and his chin lifted in a human imitation of a wolf testing a scent. He had not the smell of sack wine on him. He had stayed sober for days. This too was a small part of the future, unfurling in the present as a quiet flag. "What happens now?" the girl asked, and Sansa answered with the first truly foolish thing she had allowed herself to say in this room. "We ask it." She laid her hand down and said in the quiet voice of a woman who has learned to keep her voice gentle, even when her intent is to cut. "We need your help. Help." As if a dragon could be a soldier sworn. As if anything under the earth understood oaths. The room's warmed air moved over her, panting not with exertion but with something larger. The crack opened another finger width and then another. The ridge rose as a ridge rises when a creature inside a shell pushes its back to it. Hide parted. Sansa did not flinch. The girl did not flinch. Theon took one step backward without meaning to. The room filled up with a sound that had not been present before. Not a roar, not the hiss of steam, not any sound men have catalogued. It was the acknowledgement within a chest. That noise a human makes too, when a decision rises from the bottom of him and he cannot push it back down. It might have taken a day for the crack to travel the length of the ridge. It might have taken an hour. Living time had no place in that space. It shifted its weight and Sansa did not insist that her mind impose order on it. When at last the ridge split end to end and lifted enough to show a gleam under, the color of that gleam was not any human jewel. It was not gold. It was not emerald. It was a color Sansa felt against the back of her eyes more than she saw. Like the green of Winterfell's pool under ice. Like the blue of water in a bottle that has been held against the fire to make it warm and safe. Like iron's soul. She realized, when she tried to compare it to something known, how poor the world is of matches for entirely new things. She gave up and stood in her poverty and loved it. The thing within exhaled. Not steam, breath. It washed over them and pressed the hair on their arms back against the skin like a lover's palm. It smelled of heat that has never known sunset and of bones buried and of the faintest sweetness, like something dried and kept for a century and only now opened. Fat tears came into Theon's eyes and hung there and did not fall because he would not give them that. He looked furious with the generosity of his own heart. The girl's mouth squared out and she looked as if she would fight the air if the air spoke against this. Sansa stood straight as if her father had just entered the room and she had not seen him alive in a long time and would not waste a moment of the sight by breaking her own posture. "Soon," she said again. And this time she was certain that the soon was for the thing as much as for herself. After the castle went about its noises, men remembered their quarrels. Meat was boiled. Blades were oiled. The winter night came early and squatted on the towers, heavy as a crow. Ramsay cursed a man for the cut of his boot leather and sent him to stand in the yard until his feet were bitten and came back and laughed himself sick when the man pretended not to mind. Sansa went down to the godswood and put her hand on the trunk of the weirwood and thought of the root in her dream. She did not believe herself a witch. She believed herself a practical woman who had made the acquaintance of an old neighbor. She leaned her head against the bark and shut her eyes. The bark did not soften. It would never perform. That comforted her perversely. In the night, she woke with a sense of being watched and discovered. After the panic had run its skitter up her spine, that the sense came from under her. It was not a human kind of watching. It was not evaluation. It was the attention of a force. She slept again and dreamed of a long road over the snow and the sound of many feet, some human, some pawed, some taloned, some hooved. She dreamed of a sea that had frozen and the creak of its shifting beneath the ice like a thing that waits its time. She dreamed of a hall with banners that were not of her house and the sound of them being taken down, one by one, with no cheering, only a quiet efficiency that was the cheaper, sterner name for joy. In the morning, she had a plan. It did not announce itself as such. It came like a list of tasks written on a slate in a kitchen. It told her to send the girl out with Theon, not both but one at a time, to map which tunnel mouths had trained watchers and which had grown soft. To set aside meat on odd days and not even ones because people prefer pattern to exception and a pattern will draw an eye. To go to the hollow twice more in daylight and once in the deep night when it was risk and she would learn what she could bear of risk. It told her to speak to Manderley without speaking, to lay a scrap under a cushion in a place she knew his man would sit his waiting backside upon, to let that man carry the scrap in the seam of his trousers to a ship that would leave in 3 days with fish in barrels and a smell of salt old as the world. She did not think the word war. She had learned that word meant banners to most men, and she did not believe in banners. She believed in what she could do with her hand and the hand nearest her. She believed in the way the stone took her foot when she placed it carefully, and the way a corridor remembered your body and shaped itself around you if you walked it enough. She believed in the dragon under her feet because she had touched it, and because it had taken the gifts she had offered, and because the breath in the floors had changed tenor since it had shown its attention. She believed in her house because she knew the bruises it had taken and the way it had kept going. The day before the day they meant to try the thing the letter had told them to ride. The sky broke and all the snow in it fell at once. You could hear snow like that fall. It makes a sound like the priming of some old engine. The castle changed shape under the snow, hulking into its truer lines as ornament was softened and bulk remained. Men went out to sweep and came back with drifts on their hats like foolish crowns. The dogs shook once at the door and refused to leave. Sansa stood at her window and watched until she felt the itch under her skin that told her she had been too long in one position and her body would turn against her if she did not move it. She took her cloak and went to the hollow, not because she had business there but because she felt an ache that implemented itself as that direction. The hollow was warm as always, warmer now with the world gnashing its teeth around it, and the steam had altered again into a finer mist. The crack showed more than crack now. It showed the dark of a nostril. That was absurd, eh? And true. She laughed softly to own her absurdity. The nostril flared in a rhythm within the rhythm of the breath. She put her hand so near it that she could feel the breath pass between her fingers. Heat went through the webbing. She felt herself savory and ridiculous and important and entirely ancillary all at once. She kept her hand there until the tremble she had not admitted to in her body settled, like a bird folding its wings when told it may perch. "We are very nearly there," she said, because she had learned that sometimes the world wishes to be told where it is in its own narrative. She withdrew her hand and turned to go, her head full of the white noise of falling. Theon waited outside the crack. He had snow in his hair and a ghost of it in his beard and a look that was both savage and mild. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. They spent the day as if it were any other. They sat in the hall and took food. The girl took her meat in a way that showed nothing to anyone who did not know what to look for, and Sansa, who would always know, let herself be warmed by it. The dogs lay with their jowls on their paws and pretended to nap while actually calculating the angles of theft. Men went to the yard and came back with their cheeks raw. Ramsay whistled and did not look at Sansa at all, which was a blessing like the absence of a thorn. The maester wrote a note to Manderley's man with his childish hand and burned it and looked out his window for a long time at the snow. Night came and the lights made little islands that looked like songs in the dark. Sansa went to bed and lay with her hand on her stomach again because that had worked before. She slept and dreamed no more than a few pictures. A horse shaking snow out of its mane so that it looked like jewels. The weirwood with a cap of white like a foolish hat. The curve of a dragon's nostril opening and closing. Dawn was a rumor at the edges, a rumor you had to prop on sticks to make it stand in that winter. Sansa dressed and put on her boots and put meat under her cloak and went to the door and opened it, and there they were. Theon grimly smiling as if someone had given him an impossible task, and he delighted in the scale of difficulty. The girl, with her shoulders squares and her hair like a dark brush. They nodded. They went. Down in the belly, the sound of the breath filled the space as if the room were a lung, and they entered into it. Sansa laid the meat down, and the room took it and did not bother to wait for gratitude. The nostril flared. The crack widened again while she stood there. That was new and dear. Theon gave a sound that was not laughter and not a sob and not what men make when they go to their knees for a god. It was the noise of a man whose world has introduced a new axis and who is finding his feet. The girl reached out and touched the edge of the crack with 2 fingers, light and immediate and without fear. The breath came out and stroked those fingers as if tasting salt. Now, Sansa said, and it was now. She did not feel brave. She felt right, as if the little puzzle in her had been put together properly and made a picture where before there had been only edges. She turned and they went. They passed into the corridor and to the tunnel. The tunnel had been found by a boy who had wanted to kiss his girl away from watchful eyes. Long before even Sansa's father had been a boy. It had been widened by men wishing to steal grain, and then narrowed again by a lord who had wanted to seal troubles under stone. It was theirs now. They took it and went. Snow hit their faces when they crawled up out of the hole. The world was white and bigger than human plans. The girl pulled her hood down and let the snow fall into her eyelashes and did not blink until it had melted. She had learned not to flinch at slow hurts. Theon went first with the caution of a man who had brought people into danger and meant to bring them out if his skin must pay for the change. Sansa followed with her heart pounding in a way that meant a person was alive. They cut across the yard not as thieves but as people whose day's business took them there, because you survive by aligning your fear with the very thing your fear would have you avoid. They reached the stable by walking as if they meant to go past it and then stepping in at the last possible moment, so that any watcher's thought would have been, oh, that is where they were going, and the watcher's laziness would have patted itself for understanding. Horses blow clouds in that kind of cold. They stamp and forget they ever knew grass. The boy who kept them had taken himself to the necessary to stamp his own feet because warmth turns men's bowels as surely as fear does. They lifted the latch. The hinge made a noise that in summer would have drawn an eye. In the blizzard it was nothing. Theon chose a mare with a temper like a useful woman's, not because it would flatter a rider's skill to master her, but because it would kill a man who thought to do it with swagger, and swagger was not invited on this ride. He took her bridle and they went out again into the white, and the world opened and swallowed them and, if anyone looked, presented them like a scene so ordinary it hurt no one's sense of the day. They went to the place they had planned, not the nearest gate but a section of wall where the snow had drifted and piled and made a foothold where men with a rope could make sense of the vertical. The rope had been fixed in the night by a boy with a short name and a courage that would never make a song. The girl went first, not because gallantry wants it, but because he who weighs least should test a thing like that. The rope held with the creak of hemp and the groan of snow and the undersound of the world's disagreement. She slid and landed and rolled and rose with a grin that was the first grin the world had seen on her face in years. Theon went, then Sansa. The snow filled her mouth. She spit and laughed and pressed her lips together so the laugh would not carry. They made for the cover of the pines. They went in. Behind them, Winterfell breathed. Under them, the dragons stirred, and men in the hall paused and looked at their spoons, and dogs whispered to their own gods, and the weirwood kept its counsel and its patience. Before them, the white lay and the road rolled under it, and the air held the taste of iron that meant a thing was beginning. The first mile was a lesson, the second a rhythm, the third something like a prayer. The mare moved under the girl like a thing that had been made for this moment. Theon ran with his breath measured and his eyes flicking to count, always counting. Sansa's head filled with the practicalities that had saved her once and would save her again. The place where her boot rubbed, the way to set her cloak so that snow slid off the shoulder and did not make a burden, the timing of when to drink from the little skin she had under her cloak and when not to move at all. They went and the snow came down and erased the record of them. And that, more than anything, was a kindness. When they stopped, under a copse of bent pines where the air was still enough that their breath hung in the needles like ornaments, Sansa put her hand to the mare's neck and felt the heat there. She felt into the heat the way she had felt into the dragon's breath. She imagined heat traveling from the thing under the castle like a current through the ground. She imagined herself the conductor. She did not permit herself, even in her mind, to call herself queen. She would be a woman who introduced old things to old things. That would be enough. That would be the right measure. They did not speak. Speech wastes air and confuses courage with noise. They looked at one another. The girl put a gloved finger to her mouth and then pointed. There, just past the bend where the creek ran under its ice, moved men. Not many. Enough to mean that other men had reasoned that snow made good cover for bad acts and had chosen to do their bad acts in daylight disguised as night. Theon's hand came to his knife and rested, then fell away. He put his mouth near Sansa's ear and said, "We can go around." She nodded and went where he went. They made their path, and the men did not see, and the gods kept their own counsel about it. When at last they came to the old mill with the slumped roof and the door that had warped into a shape like a groan, the window, which had no glass and had never had glass so far as Sansa could tell, showed a face inside. A woman's face. A woman beyond the years when men take inventory of them. The woman made a very small sign with her hand, like turning a page of a book under a candle. Sansa recognized it and did not know how she recognized it. It meant, "The room is safe if anything is." They went in. Heat hit them like a wall because the woman had kept a fire the way women of the north keep a fire when there is no meat in the pot, as the proof that we are yet alive and we will stay so because of this little discipline. She had put on to boil what looked like stones and what would make a thin broth that tasted of none of the hopes hungry people pin upon it, and yet would keep children from shaking with the cold. She said no words until they had stood and let the room see them entire. Then she nodded as if things had fallen into the shape she deserved and said, "I knew one of you would come. I said to my niece, it will be the one with the eyes like the father. And here," she put her hand out, quick as the peck of a bird, and touched the girl's cheek. "Here she is." It was as if Winterfell had sent out roots uncatalogued by any map of roads. They took not the shortest way but the way that turned around the stones that remember. Sansa sat near the fire and warmed the stump of bread in her hands and sniffed the lisolade of the stone soup and thought, "The way back is the same as the way out, only now there are more of us, and that is the difference between winning and dying out here." She thought of the dragon under the castle and felt inside herself the flaring of the nostril like the pulse you feel in the wrist of your child when you have been frightened of fever and are relieved to find only a rate that says, "Remain calm." The woman's niece came in with a basket and shook the snow off her hair and said a word that was the name of a bird and the name of the girl at once. And Sansa learned it and kept it in her mouth like a sugared almond to suck when courage flagged. On the return there were boot prints. There were always boot prints. That is the business of the living, to leave marks and to try to make them in places where they will read later as the right sort of history. The snow covered some. The wind did some. Sansa did some with the careful placement of her heel and the exact angle of her toe. Theon reached the rope and tested it with a jerk a more nervous man would not have dared. It held. He went up last because one carries the weight one ought, if one intends to be the kind of man who can live with himself later. They went back inside the world that does not scald because it is designed to keep the scald for a particular night. The hollow was waiting. The breath was eager. Sansa laughed without sound. The nostril flared and the smoke came, like a welcome. She set the last of the saved meat down and did not watch it go. She turned, she who had learned the ritual, and kissed the girl's forehead like a sister and said the words she had not permitted herself for so long and now could because they were the right tool for this job. "We take it back." The girl nodded. Theon put his hands flat on the stone where the steam had wetted it. He looked at the crack and at the eye that remained unshown, and he said, in a voice like a prayer said in a language one has not spoken since childhood but that comes back by shape if not by sense, "Help us do it right. Under Win." Winterfell, the dragon breathed, and in the deep of its mind, if it had such, and what else had it done but demonstrate that knowing exists outside the human? It turned toward the sound of war not because war is desirable but because old promises, made before men had language and handed down through roots and stone and the long bone breath of winter, had been invoked in the oldest manner, with meat and patience and names said not as boasts but as claims. Above, the weirwood's branches shook empty snow they had caught, and the flakes drifted down like the shed of old arguments. The men in the hall bickered about nothing. Ramsay threw his dog a bone and watched the dog snap and thought himself master of a cosmology. Sansa slept for an hour with her mouth open and dreamed of a field of wolves moving through tall grass so slowly you could not see the stalks bend. Until suddenly the whole field lay down and you saw how many there had been, and the number steeled and did not frighten her. She woke and there was morning, and there was meat to set aside and messages to send and a route to test and a dragon to feed, and under everything the sense, at last, that her house had put its hand upon a pulse and found it strong. Morning was a gray animal that pressed its cold flank to the stone and breathed a rhyme onto the windows. It brought a steadiness to the noise of the castle, as if every sound had been spun on some invisible wheel and now came round again with the same interval as before. Sansa woke into it with her hand already lifted and hovering an inch above her belly. That new habit that calmed the pulse without demanding anything of the throat. The breath under the floors came up to meet her palm as if it had learned her shape. She closed her eyes a moment longer to listen and found, as she had the last 3 dawns, that listening was no longer a thing she did with the ears alone but with the bones, as if the marrow in her had grown a little chamber whose only task was to hold the hum. When she sat up, the room's cold placed its teeth lightly on her shoulders and then let go, respectful of the heat that had seeped from below. She dressed without fumbling. The practice of dressing like a woman who expects to be looked at by men, who will use the sight for their own comfort, had taught her hands to be quick and the lines to lay properly on the skin. She bound her hair back and looked into the small mirror the maester had once pressed on her with a mutter about glass and how it makes a world of its own. She saw a face that had shed one girl and grown another, with the stark jaw that strangers read like a heraldic device and the tully eyes that had learned to look and give nothing they did not intend. She thought idly that mirrors lie unless you ask them the right question. She set it aside. In the corridor, the air smelled of old wet wool and iron and the ghost of onions. Theon waited 2 doors down with his back to the wall, so he would not be startled from behind. That was the trick of him now, the way he spent himself anticipating the blow, the way he had made of foresight a superstition that sometimes kept his shape intact. He lifted his chin when she came, not exactly a smile, not anything so soft, but the acknowledgement of a partner. Behind him, at the corner where the arrow slit turned frost to opal, the girl leaned with one hip set so that she could spring without telegraphing the spring. She had slept badly, and you could see it only if you knew where to look. The skin under her eyes had the hollowness of hunger's cousin and not hunger itself. She had a new blade at her waist. New in this context meant a kitchen knife had been ground thin and had learned to call itself something else. They went as they had learned to go, each taking a part of the watch, Theon for sound, the girl for motion, Sansa for temperature. The strange division that had emerged without discussion, as if something older than them had measured their gifts and laid them out like knives on a table. A maid stepped out from the stair and nearly walked into them. She carried a basket of kindling, and the basket made her look like a child on an errand. But her shoulders bore the weight of a woman whose warnings had all been given and ignored and thus were now kept as a private hoard. She bobbed without curtsy and slid past, a tiny realignment in the castle's flows. The hollow received them with a polite exhalation. Sansa thought every time that courtesy was a virtue of the old gods. You did not demand it. You provided it so that what you loved would not be inconvenienced by you. She set the wrapped meat on the floor and did not watch it. She had learned to look at the room rather than the vanishing. Steam wrote its script over the spring. The letters were insistently nothing men named, and yet the eye wanted to read. The crack had lengthened so that when the room pulsed, a breath slid out around the edges, and the breath had warmed enough she did not have to imagine warmth to feel it. She put her palm on the hide that was not hide, and the heat went into her hand and up the arm and made a nest under the bone of her shoulder. The girl touched, too, without asking, because permission had been made once and did not need renewing in every breath. Theon stood where he stood, hands open and empty, the posture a servant uses when the Lord enters, and also the posture a man uses when his hands are kept unarmed so that others need not fear him. He was tired and would never say it. He was healing and would not admit it even to himself. Sansa glanced at him and saw the new way he carried the weight of his head. The neck had taken back some of the work from the shoulders, and this was a map of hope. "Food will move tonight," he said. speaking softly because sound made patterns in steam that might be read by anyone who knew to look. Manderley's man will be at the broken trough near the slaughterhouse. There is to be a sack that tears and grain that goes where it should not. I will be there before the tear. I will be there after. I will be nobody who is anywhere in particular. Good, Sansa said. And the rope? Checked. I stood beneath it and tugged until my hands burned. And if I have miscalculated, the least of what will punish me is the fall. The girl's mouth tilted. Will not fall because you have grown careful. There was no mockery in it. She meant careful as the opposite of fear, as a form of power. She gave the hide her other palm. For a moment her whole face eased, like a child who has gone to sleep at last on a long journey and learned, a sleep, that the carriage will go on without her effort. They were tempted to stay. That was the danger of the hollow now. It gave back to them their own steadiness, as if they had left it there in some older year and could come to borrow it and might never go again. Sansa stepped away by a small act of discipline and saw the steam curl after her wrist as if reluctant. She backed into the corridor and breathed Winterfell, which had its own flavor of warm stone and old breath. The girl followed, then Theon, who touched the wall before leaving, a gesture almost reverent and completely without ceremony. In the yard, the snow had sagged under a night that had given more weight than glitter. Men shoveled with the particular stubbornness the North breeds, moving the same mass from one place to another and calling that work proud. A boy ran past with a broom like a weapon and fetched up in a drift to a squeal he transformed into a cough at the last instant. The dogs had found a patch of sun and laid it claim with their spines. Ramsay was not in evidence. That, Sansa had learned, was worse than his presence. Absence let the mind practice its inventions and draw pictures of knives. She let her eyes touch the faces they could afford. Dull men, tired men, men whose loyalties were not loyalties but ruts, and kept them off the sharp faces that would turn and mark her. The glass gardens sweated in their panes. She walked there because that had become part of the pattern anyone might see and so could not be used as a map to anything else. Inside it smelled of green and the slight rot the cook had not yet purged from a corner. It smelled hopeful and melancholy at once. The maester sat on his stool under the orange tree that had learned to bear little hard fruit only as a matter of principle and not in any amount. His hands held a jar of beeswax and a cloth, polishing a scale weight that did not need polishing. He looked at her and did not, and the amount he did not look was the amount of help he could give. When she sat, the cushion gave her the scrap his own hands had tucked there, and she took it and left it and came again later, a woman with her hands full of nothing, and the scrap said 3 days. 3 days was a measure that turned a heart into a metronome. She did not send for sisters and banners. She sent meat and felt for cracks and walked her steps and turned talk the way a shepherd turns sheep that have got it into their heads to go over a cliff because the first had gone. On the first day in that count, she found the girl in the armory with her feet set on the old stone in a way that wrote a sentence. This square, then that again. The girl had made a rough sword from a dull practice blade, had honed it until it flicked a whisker off a hair without making the hair know it had been shaved. She moved in a pattern of steps that had no hero in it. It was grim and domestic, a pattern for clearing a room of men who will not leave willingly. Between one step and another she looked up and saw Sansa watching and smiled a little, and Sansa, against her will, felt something in her chest crack and let out a warm rush that embarrassed her. She turned the embarrassment into counsel. "No flourishes," she said. "If you have more than you need for a strike, put it back in your pocket and spend it on running." The girl nodded, solemn and greedy for anything that would make her better. "I know," she said. "I used to think that everything was a stage. I don't anymore. I want to do things that do not look like anything until after they are done." "Good," Sansa said. "Then you will live to see the after." On the second day she went to the Stone King's with Theon. He had asked without asking. He had looked toward the stair and looked back at her, and she had understood that going alone would harm him. The crypts exhaled the kind of cold that remembers heat. The torches made islands out of each face. They turned shadows into doctrine. The stone wolves at the feet of old lords had collected dust in their mouths until their lips were a gray line. She stopped by the first of the kings carved with less finesse, where the mason cared about the curve of the jaw more than the shape of the eye, and then by the later, where eyes had been given stars, which men called realism and she called flattery. Theon trailed his fingers along the chiseled name of a lord who had been the particular pride of old songs and said nothing for a long time. When he did, his voice rasped and made the stone give his words back to him half a breath later, as if some other man were shadowing his speech. "I put a child here," he said. "No ornament on it, no excuses. Not the one I said, neither of the ones I said. That is not what haunts me. What haunts me is that I could, that there was in me the place for that. When I stand before these, I think it was not only me. I think it was always there. And I am sorry, not to them, they are stone. To the women who do not have their sons. To the dogs who were taught to eat meat meant for men. To the men who taught the dogs." Sansa put her hand on the wolf carved at her father's feet and felt the grit, which was like bread ground in a pestle, and said, "Then do a thing with that. If you cannot leave the place in you that did it, fill it with something more useful." She heard herself and thought that once she had found such sentences precious. Now the world had made her practical, and practicality makes anything it touches bleed, but it also makes a salve. He nodded without gratitude, "Good," and put his hand over hers on the stone. The stone gave nothing and everything. On the third day, the winter town moved in its checked way, half hibernation, half February madness. The tanner's yard steamed and sent an odor into the sky that made birds think twice and go elsewhere. Children slid on a patch of ice until a woman stuck her head out and shouted the name of a dead man in anger, and then the name of a live child in tenderness. And Sansa felt both names in her stomach as if each had weight. She stood outside a weaver's shop and put her glove against the glass to see in, and the weaver, an old woman with a throat like an accordion, took up a length of gray and a length of darker gray and wove them together until the line between them undid itself. Sansa watched and took it as a lesson in making two things one in a way no eye could unpick. The niece from the mill came with her basket and her good shoes and did not look at Sansa or at the girl, and the way she did not look was a feat. A man with a hare slung over his shoulder walked past, dragging the hare's feet to erase his tracks. He didn't need to do that in a town, but habit is a religion for the poor. Sansa loved him a little for it. When she came back, the maester had left a book on a table in the solar where a boy told stories about fruit flies to the rafters. The book was a northern history that the South would have called illiterate for its lack of gilding and its preference for fact over epigraph. There was a ribbon in a chapter men no longer read, about a winter so long that the women bled ice and the tea steeped cold, and the men who went to get firewood came back with their hands full of wolves because wolves burned better. The chapter was written in a hand slower than the rest, as if the scribe had stood and warmed his fingers and perhaps wept and returned to push on. Said, "We made a bargain." It did not say with whom. Said, "Under the house we buried a coal." It did not say how a coal could have breath. The words felt as if the scribe had been at pains to say as little as he could without lying. She closed the book and pressed her palm to it, as if that might translate omission into confession, and then lifted her hand and went to walk her steps. On the wall, where the wind came in with teeth and left with a coin of flesh for payment, Jon sat with Ghost's head heavy on his thighs and a letter in his hand. The letter had been written on rough paper with a black that wanted to lift off onto the fingers if handled too much. He had handled it enough to have a smudge like a bruise on his thumb. Said little. Said, "The floors have a heartbeat." Said, "The old stirs and is fed." Said, "Do not send banners." It had been signed with nothing, not even a flourish that a man might recognize later and call name. He had the feeling of being held by the front of his shirt by news and asked to keep breathing. He stood and set Ghost's head off him and went to the slit that served him as a window and looked out over the top of the world. The snow had blown into patterns like ribs. He said nothing because he knew that if he spoke any thought out here, it would freeze and fall and be stepped on by a man with less use for it. Sam had once sat and spoken to him about the histories of dragons and eggs and songs that had been almost lost and almost found. In those days, Jon had thought himself a boy with a sword who believed that his sword would suffice. Now he had no illusions about sufficiency. He knew that sufficiency is a god that needs feeding and that his own meals were thin. He copied the letter in his head in the hand of a man he had never met and learned it as one learns a prayer. He set a raven to the east with a note that had a phrase a man he trusted would understand, the kind of phrase that looks like a wine stain to a reader who hasn't been taught to taste. He set another bird to White Harbor with nothing in its tube, because emptiness is a message when sent from a place where men expect command. Ghost lifted his head and made a low sound that had thirst in it and longing and some old seed of home. John set his hand on the wolf's skull and said, "Soon," and did not know to whom he lied or told truth. Bran dreamed, and his dream took on a weight that became sometimes a waking inside the dream. The weirwoods were a net that hung the world together by joints. He moved along the lines and came above Winterfell and the godswood that knew the sound of his father's boots and his mother's voice and his own childhood laugh when it still had milk in it. He went down the route as he had before, but with a different caution, as if one approaches a friend recovering from illness and does not crash in with a shout. The route descended as good routes do, persistent and patient, and at its end it held itself above the thing in the belly with such yearning that Bran felt it in his mouth. The eye that was not an eye slid under the cracked lid. It was a looking that had no iris in it. It knew him in the way a landscape knows the wind, not by face but by pattern. He thought the words he had been given to use for talking to trees and to dead men who sit in them and did not try them here. He thought instead of meat and of patience and of women's hands. He sent down that thought like a bucket lowered. The bucket came up heavy. The other time he had looked, he had been moved to pity and to fear. Now he felt a different thing, a cousin to both, recognition. The coal had been buried because men had learned that heat keeps a house and consumes it in the same breath. They had made a bargain, this was true in the way the chapter said, and bargains are old as bites. He thought of the cold outside him and the heat under the sea. Astle, and he thought of ice and fire and how men love to speak of them as if they were lovers caught forever in a clutch when most days they simply lie beside each other and do not look. He touched the weirwood with his dream hand, and the tree sent, down its wet meat of a root, the knowledge that the coal had turned in its sleep and it was nearly time to put a pot on. He woke with the taste of iron and sap in his mouth and did not speak of it. He stretched his legs and hated his legs and loved them at once and then moved his arms until the blood warmed his fingers, as if he held, there, a small room of his own. The night after the third day, men came snuffling at the corridor that led to the hollow. They were not dogs, but they had learned dogs' tricks, and they were worse for it because men who choose to act like dogs do it for license, not for loyalty. One of them carried a collar at his belt. It made a small chain noise that had turned more than one girl's stomach. Theon had been ready for them because he had learned that Ramsay's attention follows heat as surely as anyone's. He had seeded the corridor that afternoon with 2 lies and 1 truth, a neat braid. A smear of tallow on a lower stone where it would catch the torchlight and look like new. A scuff of boot toe like a sign left by an arrogant man, and the small truth that there was a stone that, when shifted, revealed a slit narrow enough for a cat. The men followed the lies as men do when they are proud of having found any trail at all. They crowded where the corridor narrowed and did not consider how that made them vulnerable. Theon stepped from a shadow in the old confidence of the boy who had hunted on his father's island and had learned every slit and spill of stone, and he took the last man in the line by the mouth and pulled him backward, a soft violence that made the body go obedient. The man jerked, flailed, and Theon did what he had promised himself he would do only when he had to. He cut the throat once, clean, and held the cut closed for a moment to let the panic in the man's hands drain away without mess. He lowered him and put his head on the stone with a gentleness that made his stomach turn. He knelt a moment with the body, an old almost prayer, then slid back into the dark to watch the others blunder into the slit and come back with dust, triumphant as if they had captured a ghost. When he came to Sansa after that, there was blood on his cuff. He held his hand away from her and did not speak of being sorry. She took his wrist and looked at the blood and said, "We will decide what this buys." And he nodded and went to wash it off with water that steamed enough to remind him that the world has a stomach. In the night he slept without a dream. In the morning he remembered the weight of the man not in his arms but in his elbow, and he used that weight like a lesson in leverage. That morning, too, the maester failed to attend a call. It was a small rebellion, the refusal to move an old leg from where it rested under a blanket to where another man wanted it. But it put a ripple into the lines of who attended whom. A boy went up the stairs to fetch him and found him sitting with his hands folded on his belly and his eyes closed. "I have lived long," he said without opening them. "I may yet live longer, but I have used up whatever store of making men comfortable I had. Tell your lord that my bones are no longer his dogs." The boy did not dare carry the phrasing and so carried a watered version. Ramsay laughed at it, that high-chopped laugh that does not go out very far and so falls back on the man who makes it. Sansa watched the laugh and saw the small tilt of his head toward the tower and understood that he had noted the maester's shape on his board at last. She sent a boy with a hot brick wrapped in cloth to the old man's room and received a nod and a look that passed for gratitude in a soul that had spent itself to keep a scrap of light. There were petty tyrannies to perform before dusk. Ramsay had a man whipped for a patch on a hose. He had a woman turned out of the kitchen for talking to another woman he had marked out as a vessel for his fears. He called Sansa to his side and pinched her elbow as if to test the ripeness of fruit and told her to sit so that he could see hands that used to wear jewels now lay quiet. She did as he bid and did not flinch when he pressed his thumb into the soft flesh below the elbow and smiled at his own power to leave a bruise. He did it because he had not the imagination to imagine that her stillness was not defeat but measurement. He ate with more noise than necessary, and the dogs drooled, and Sansa found herself remembering the way the dragon's breath had stroked her palm and let the thought stand between them like an invisible man with a sword. She left the table when courtesy could be invoked like law and went to the girl with the practicalities of dusk in her shoulders. They took the rope and the hole and the air. Outside, the snow had thinned to a sift that lay itself down politely on the shoulders of things. The mare had been stabled and was not for this work. They went on feet and for the way children play bears in a hall when the grown men are asleep. The world smelled of tin and pine. Theon went first again because it was his right now without his ever having claimed it aloud. The girl came after with a quiet that would have startled a deer. Sansa followed with a torch cupped so that the flame looked like a private sin. They reached the trough and the sack with a tear that had not yet torn, and the man whose job it had been for 30 years to lift sacks and to move them as if each were a relation. He looked at them and did not see them and turned, and his boot caught on a broken plank, and he swore without anger, the kind of training that shows a man has given himself the right to vent without any hope that the venting changes the world. "Ah," he said, and the sack tore, and grain went in a line as neat as a monk's letter toward the place where someone later could gather it up and know that this was not waste but guide. Sansa knelt and put her hand in the grain and lifted it as if weighing it, and the man smiled at her as if she were his small daughter playing at a thing, and she smiled back and felt the corner of the world tilt a degree, and then right itself. Theon vanished the way smoke does when a draft opens. The girl took the other side of the trough and looked like a shadow taught to carry baskets. They went on. They checked the stable latch, touched the iron and warmed it with gloved palms so it would not squeal. They breathed into the map they had made of the yard and made a small correction. A man who liked to piss by a certain post had not done so. That meant he was ill or absent or had been sent with a message. Absence was information. Sansa tucked it inside her coat, next to the heat she had stolen from the breath below. They went to the hollow last because it had made itself into a sort of home and so should be kept to last. In that room, steam had webbed the air to a fineness like thread, and the breath that came from the crack was sweeter, less mineral. She thought, foolishly, of apples stored in straw. She did not bring meat that night. She brought an empty hand and the kind of presents you bring to a child's bed when the child does not need anything but proof that you will sit and not be frightened by the dark. She laid her palm on the hide and thought her name, and then the girl's name, and then her father's and mother's and the names that had built the house and weighted its corners and kept it from being blown away by the people who treat history as if it were a carpet to roll up and carry off. The dragon breathed and the color under the lid shifted. A blue deeper than winter's, an iron with a vein running through it that had never seen sun. In White Harbor, Wyman Manderley moved a fat finger on his board and sent a ship not on the board and felt satisfaction turn into duty again. A letter lay open at his elbow. It said in a hand he knew from a boy he had taught to steal apples and not be caught. 3 days to frost. He had eaten 2 oysters and found in one a pearl no larger than a tear. He had not remarked on it in front of the men who had brought him the tray, and after he had closed the door and laughed aloud once, he had put the pearl in his mouth and rolled it under his tongue as if to season himself. He took it out now and set it on the edge of the board. He put his forefinger on the ship carved like a whale and nudged it into the shallows. "Go," he told it, as if wooden toys obeyed commands, and perhaps they did, if the commands were old enough. He sent, with the ship, 3 men who had once proved they could be quiet in a noisy room, and 3 girls who had once proved they could keep secrets without turning them into pride. They carried barrels of dried fish with the salt crusted on the outside and the flesh inside like leather, and within those barrels little packets wrapped in eelskin that held things a house needs when it intends to do something large and yet wishes to look small. Needles mixed sizes, a coil of wire thin as hair, a stone that makes a spark without crying about it, a bottle with a neck broken and resealed that would smell of onions if you sniffed and smell of death if you poured. He told the men the story they were to tell if stopped. He told the girls another. He told none of them the picture in his head of a dragon old as the first fish and a girl old as a riverland story and a boy with a salt's humor made into a man who knows how to shut his mouth. He thought of the pie he would bake when the time came, and he smiled and did not lick his lips, though the urge was there and human. The next morning, the girl found a child in the corridor that dog keepers like to use. A child whose nose ran always and whose hair stuck to his cheek like old paint. He had a bit of string in his hand and a game in his mouth, the kind boys invent to make the world bearable, nonsense words tied together into a tune without tune. The floor will tell, the floor will tell, the floor will tell. She put her hand over his mouth very gently, and the child looked up at her and saw something that made him fall still without fear. When she took her hand away, he did not sing. She gave him the string, and he took the string as if it were a royal gift and went away to find a corner where no one ever looked, and string could be the most important thing in the world for a little while. That afternoon Sansa went to the great hall and watched men award themselves thrones with their elbows. She took the measure of each face as if she were a tailor fitting a jacket that needed to look better than it fit. She kept her mouth soft. She thought about the dragon not because it gave her joy, but because it gave her a fixed point. A man with a laugh like a cough told a story, and the punch of it was that a wife had been fooled by a husband's cunning, and she let her eyes go slightly unfocused in the way that says boredom and then snap back into focus in the way that says pounce. And she caught sight of a thing small and real. A boy at the far table slipping his bread to a dog because his belly hurt. She felt love for the boy that was not the girl sort of love she had learned to put aside, and not the mother sort of love that the world would use to bind her, but another kind, civic, you might call it, if Winterfell were a city and not a house. She lowered her gaze and let him give his bread. They met in the solar that evening, all 3, the room warm because the winter had done them the courtesy, and she spread her hands on the table and they put theirs over hers. Theon's skin ran warmer than any other man she had ever touched. This surprised her for a moment and then did not, when she remembered the Iron Islands and the boy who had come to Winterfell. Why? 'Tis the smell of salt so sunk into his bones that bathing never washed it. The girl's hand lay small and hard and quick, like an animal that consents to be held only if you hold it right. "Tomorrow," Sansa said, and at the word the breath under the floors answered with a little push against her chair leg, as if the house itself had cleared its throat. She laughed and did not. She could not stop herself. They laughed, too, and the laughing was careful because laughter is a luxury and they had learned to spend it wisely. In the night before the morning of tomorrow, snow came sideways and rattled the arrow slits like a maid shaking a rug. Sansa woke 3 times and each time felt the dragon breathe as if it had turned in its sleep, and the turning had shifted the balance of the bed she lay in, lightening it. The 3rd time she rose and put her feet down onto the warm stone with the gratitude of a pilgrim who admits now that the shrine is real. She dressed in the dark. The leather of her boots creaked. She slid the knife into her sleeve and did not think of it as a knife. She thought of it as an answer. They went. The corridor held their shape as they passed. The rope looked thinner because dawn does that to everything. It makes the world honest and bitingly small. The trough, the tear, the man. The woman inside the stable telling a story to a horse, exactly as if the horse needed it. The way the yard seems to breathe in the last minute before it is truly awake. They crossed. The wall gave them its rough toeholds. Theon went first, the girl second, Sansa last, and the drop was a moment of truth for the part of a person that panics separate from all good sense and wants to throw itself into the dark to be done with this. She did not indulge that part. She set it in a chair in a corner and told it to be quiet, and it obeyed. Boots met ground. The pines with a new voice in them because the wind had risen. The niece from the mill was a point in a field of points. She moved with the purpose of a woman who knows that purpose is all that stands between her and rage. The old woman sat by the pot of stones again, and this time the stones had been joined by a bit of cabbage and an onion gone soft on one side. The girl kissed the woman's cheek before the woman could stop her, and the woman swatted at her as at a fly and then pulled her into her bony arms and hung on in a way that made Sansa look inward and steady herself. She was surprised, not at the feeling but at its simplicity. She let herself have it for 5 breaths and no more. A young man came in with snow under his nails and said a name that had not been said in the hall for years, and Sansa schooled her mouth to give nothing away, and the name hung in the room like steam. He had a message sewn into the hem of his shirt. He tore the seam and brought out the scrap and handed it to the girl, who did not look at it and put it into the small pocket sewn into her sleeve. "Later," she said. "Later is sooner if we take care of now." Sansa loved her for that sentence as if she had invented it herself. On the way back they did not go the same way as before. Theon took them over a patch of brook whose ice showed black under the white and whose sound under the feet was not the sound a safe thing makes. He had calculated the thickness and his calculation was good. He had learned to value his own numbers again, and this was worth more than a feast, but even good numbers have shadows. The ice spoke. The girl leaped without sound. Sansa went light. The crack ran behind them like a swift little snake and then turned on itself and was still. Theon laughed, once, from the belly. He could not help it. He turned the laugh into a grunt, and they went on and did not leave behind them any sign that they had laughed. Back inside, the air of the corridor weighed more. You could feel a piece of it on your shoulder. The hollow was a different room again. Steam now came lower, as if drawn by a mouth. The crack had opened enough that a man could lay his fingers along it and feel the slick of what lay beneath, and Theon had the sense not to do it. Sansa did. She laid her fingers on the edge and the breath rolled over her knuckles, and she thought of a forge with no smoke and a heart with no blood. The girl laid her cheek against the hide and closed her eyes and seemed to sleep that way. 2 breaths, 3, and then opened them and looked at Sansa, and there was the first mischief Sansa had seen since the girl had come home. "It likes me," she said, and because it was so absurd, Sansa let herself nod gravely and say, "Very likely." And they held each other's eyes and grinned and then sobered, because what they were doing would kill people, and that mattered even if the people deserved killing. Sansa set her hand lower on the ridge, near where the shape suggested a shoulder if you knew how to see anatomy of a thing no man had drawn properly in centuries. And then she felt it, a muscle tightening. Not large, not a flex to toss her to the ground, though some part of her had half wanted that. A small readiness. "Soon," she said, out of habit, and then she stopped herself and spoke to it as she had not yet done, using not the rhythm of the South's prayers or the North's bluntness but her own speech, learned in this castle and among its steam and bone. "Wait for us to be clever," she said. "We are not strong yet. We are clever. Wait until we have raised the clever into strength." The room gave a slow breath as if in agreement, and Sansa stood and brought out from under her cloak a parcel wrapped in an old cardy-wool square that had been her mother's once and had served as blanket and shawl and mop and will serve now as covering for this. Within was not meat. It was bone. Not a man's. She had not come to that. She did not know if she would. A stag's leg, knuckled, with the marrow still in it. She set it near the crack and watched the breath draw along it and into it as if extracting essence. The wood of the room creaked the way boats creak when they have sea under them and are old but remember what it is to carry. Ramsay came upon them later in the day, not there, of course, but in a corridor 4 turns from the kitchens, and took Sansa by the wrist and turned her and put his mouth near her ear and said, in a voice like thickened sugar, "Do you know, little bird, why this old place is warm?" He slurred little. He liked to act the lexicographer in his own house. He liked to make definitions that men would accept as law. She set her face with its most simple expression and said, "No, my lord." He laughed, small and squeezed her wrist until she felt the small bones grind. "Because men like me live here." He liked it so well he said it twice. She did not look at his mouth. She looked at his shoulder, where a seam had been badly repaired and would come apart, and she put that small prophecy into her pocket to take out later and enjoy alone. When he let her go, she let her wrist hang until the pain had drained down and pooled in the palm, and then she shook it out and put her hand on the wall to take a bit of the castle's steadiness again. She made herself learn, once more, the shape of the pain and the way it did not undo her. That too was use. News came like shy animals do, in bits of fur, in scat, in a track half obliterated by wind. A washwoman from the tarnside came to the kitchen to sell gossip and a pail of milk and told of a Karstark boy angry enough to kick a tree and break a toe for his anger. A shepherd from a ridge line nobody visited in weather like this told the hostler that the stars had looked lower last night and he had smelled iron where there was no iron, and his grandmother had told him to bring that smell here. Men who had been friends of no one for 2 winters met by accident under the arch and forgot to hate and let themselves be neutral, and then leaned and passed something in the space between their shoulders that looked like nothing at all and was, nonetheless, the weight of a vow. In the evening, the maester, who had rehearsed it at least 20 times in his head, as if that could keep the world from blowing a cold wind through his courage, hobbled with his stick to the kennel. The kennel boy, no longer the boy who had sung, looked at him with those eyes that are always older than the mouths they sit above. "You shouldn't," he said, and the old man laughed a little, because telling the old what they should and should not do assumes the old fear death. He had long since stopped fearing the big thing. He feared the little ones. Humiliations, indignities, obligations taken from his hands at last. "I am going to sit," he said, and sat on a stool and let the dogs come to him and sniff his stick and his hem and his bones. He had a piece of dried offal in his sleeve for the smallest bitch, the one who had learned to look harmless and had learned to make that a weapon. He fed her and she licked his fingers with a small industrious tongue, and he nodded as if a bargain had been struck. Perhaps it had. He had brought a different thing in the other sleeve, a vial with a stopper a child could pull out with her teeth. He did not intend to use it on a man. That was not his quarry. He intended the rats. He had a map of the tunnels in his head that had been added to by men whose hands had not had the patience to set it down on vellum, and he had marked with a mental pin a place where a collapse would do no harm to anyone he cared to preserve and might do harm to any man he did not. He set his vial down where a rat would scent it and carry the scent into that seam and so dissuade any nose from following, and if a man he did not like sniffed there and recoiled and called it poison, he would perform innocence as easily as he had once performed erudition. He was a maester. He had a chain and so had been told that his purpose was prescribed. His purpose had always been particular. He rose and let his knee creak and went out with the dog's breath on his hand and did not look back. Not because he was hard, but because looking back, like drinking at the wrong time, makes an act wobble. That night they ate, as they did every night they could, in the small room near the kitchen where the noise of the hall came through like a tapestry. Colors, general shapes, no faces. The stew had gone thin. The bread had a cold line in it where the heat had not reached when it had been baked. Sansa did not mind. She broke it there and thought of her mother cutting molds off a cheese and making the salvage seem luxuriously deliberate. The girl told the story the niece had sent. A man on the road with a sack of oats had been stopped by 2 men who had asked for the oats and had received a laugh, and then had found themselves both with their feet in the sack while the man had tightened it from the top and rolled them into a drift and left them there for someone who had more appetite for company than he. The girl told it without the alignments of revenge, as if she preferred the clean mechanics of a thing done well to the fodder it makes for gloating. Theon listened and once, only once, laughed. A dry bark of regret and delight bound in the same skin. They returned to their beds at different times, like passengers on a ship keeping watch. Sansa slept and did not, and when she woke in that third of the night when a house is freest to speak its mind, she went to the window and put her forehead against the cold glass and looked for nothing in particular. The sky had cleared and stars had tried to have their say through the cold, their light brittle and old as coins. Beneath her feet, the breath came steady. Somewhere down the corridor, a man coughed and did not stop until he had made the sound that says the cough has seen him and been satisfied. She chose not to go to the hollow. Love of a secret can become a vice. She lay down again because she had learned that sleep is not remorse for. the proud. It is a weapon you sharpen every night you can. In the morning she went to her father. The stone of him did not change for her. It had never, it would not. But the light in the crypts shifts with the hour and with the weather and with the small offerings men make when no one watches. And that morning the torch buried in its bracket on the west wall had smutted the ceiling with smoke, so that the face of her father looked as if it had been framed by a darkness that had once been angry and was now abashed. She stood with the wolf's muzzle to her hip and spoke to her father as if he were there, because that had always been the trick of the crypts. They made men talk to stone and think themselves ridiculous, and then talk again and find, not words in answer, but a better arrangement of their own. She told him the state of his house with the economy he would have preferred. She told him they had woken the coal. She told him she would not ask his approval, because there are acts you do not ask the dead to bless. They will either bless them or not, and you will live with it either way. When she had finished, she put her hand on the cheek of the stone and did not mind the grit. "I will bring us home," she said, and the torch flickered, which is what torches do, and nothing else moved, which is what crypts do, and she went up into the world where things do not stay still long enough to become noble. Ramsay smelt the change as a dog smells a bitch in heat and could not locate the source, and so grew sour. He made mistakes. They were small and human and fatal in their part. He placed a man who drank on the door that needed a man who could stay awake through a lullaby. He struck a groom who had once come to him of his own will with a small secret, and so made that secret take a different road. He set a trap in a corridor that had been used once before for a trap, and thought that repetition is cunning rather than exhaustion. He called for Sansa, and when she did not come at once, he came himself, and when he found her in the glass garden with a leaf in her fingers and the line of her mouth very mild, he said, with that smile that showed the child in him with his worst toys, "You think me a fool." She could have answered that one many ways. She chose none. She lowered her head, because she had learned now that lowering is not submission when your neck has been stiff the rest of the day. He slapped her then for the lowering, which had not been meant as insolence, and thus made the slap not catharsis but a blow kicked at a dog. Her head went to the side. There was a taste like tin. She straightened and looked at him, and did not look away, and did not look at the hand. He laughed again, too quickly, and left her there, and she stood and forced herself not to touch her face with her fingers, because that would have been a new thing for a watcher to read, and she did not want to write that sentence in anyone. Later, alone, she pressed her palm to the place and then to the hide in the hollow, and felt the two pains reconcile into a single proof. The dragon moved. It did not break free. There would be time enough for that, and the castle would decide when it wished to be ridden by that act. It moved the way a sleeper moves when a dream reaches the place where the body learns it has hands. The ridge lifted an inch and lay down and lifted again, and the breath came so warm Sansa thought perhaps men above might feel a sudden luck and not know why. The girl leaned close enough that her eyelashes shook with the breath, and Theon laughed the small bark again and said, because he could not help himself, "There you are then." He had the expression men get at the birth of a child. Awe, terror, a fear of their own unworthiness combined with a foolish pride. Sansa bent and made herself level with the crack, and for the first time she saw not an eye, but the thing a mind makes when it wants an eye to be there. She blinked and it was gone, and she did not mind. She was content now to be the kind of person who joyfully mistakes signs. That had been trained out of her once, and she was reclaiming it. On the wall, in that morning, Jon sent 2 men south with nothing more than orders to look and to smell and to decide, and to come back not if they had news but if they had experience. He did not tell them where to go. That would have made it his journey and not theirs. He gave them a phrase to use at a door in the winter town that would open not a door but a question. And if they answered it properly, it would open a mouth, and if they did not, it would open a knife. He watched them go until their shapes were swallowed in the white, and then he put his head back and looked up at the sky. He said, out loud, because there was no one to hear, and he had learned that sometimes saying a thing where no ear is a charm. Hold! The days went on, and each was heavy and exact and mattered. Theon took a map off a drunken man with a casualness that made the theft into mercy. Ironically, the map had been accurate once and was now useless, and Theon burned it after taking what could be of its lies for his own truth. The girl skinned a rabbit without tearing the gut, and then left the skin where a fox would find it, and so saved a hen's life by diligent misdirection. Sansa found the right word to say to a boy who had been hurt and wanted to make of his hurt a weapon. She turned it into a rope, which is a different thing, and the boy sweetened under her hand like hard bread softened in broth. The maester, who had been brave once and cowardly often and now had come into a courage tired of rehearsing itself, sat in the rookery and watched a raven preen and thought of all the messages birds carry that never came from ink and wax. He thought of how often a woman's hands have carried meaning for which birds get the credit. At last the day came when it would happen, whatever that meant. They did not name it. Naming would have made it too small. The morning light had a thinness, a sharpness. When she looked at the snow, she could see individual crystals before her. I turned them into a field. This felt like a gift. The dragon had taken meat without meat for 2 days, had accepted heat through her palms as if heat could be food, had moved with that ordinary miracle of a body that knows what it does without a command from a mind. The girl had arranged for a cart to break a wheel at a particular place, and for 3 men to swear in such a way that a guard would be obliged to come and order, and so be in the wrong place for the shout. Theon had salted a scrap of fish and slipped it to a dog who would not forget and might choose, at the right time, to follow his nose and thus be a loud distraction where someone wanted a loud distraction. The maester had drawn a line on a chart only he uses and then wiped it off with his sleeve, and the line remained anyway, because that is how intent works. Sansa went down the last time before. She had thought to bring words and found herself taking only her hands. She crouched as if gathering a child and placed her palms and took 3 entirely unnecessary breaths and then spoke. Not a prayer and not a command. We will open. We will open from above when you open from within, and we will not loose you where you will break yourself. She stood and kissed the hide, quick and unceremonious, because another part of her wanted to kneel and weep, and she had not earned that yet. The hide warmed under her mouth. The room filled with a smell like turning earth. She went up into the castle while it still looked like a castle and not like a story, and stood in the hall and looked at the banners that were not hers and knew, for the first time since the hall had become a sort of stage for other men's lies, that those banners would come down, and it would not be because someone had cut them and shouted, but because they would no longer make sense to anyone who looked at them. She ate. She drank a small cup of something hot and bitter. Ramsay called her name and she did not go. He came and found the air around her different. He scowled and could not say why. She was in the same dress, her hair in the same braid, and his hands closed on nothing. He turned away. They were in the corridor when it began. The crack spoke, that same eggshell sound, and then the sound you hear when a seat coat splits and a root uncurls. Too fine for any ear, and yet the body knows it has happened. The floor gave a little under the foot, not soft, not dangerous, but like a bed shakes when someone in it rolls over. Men in the hall stopped eating. Dogs made a sound like question. A cask in the cellar rolled on its chocks and clonked back into place. Steam rose the way banners will when a wind has come out of nowhere. The girl looked at Sansa and grinned a feral grin, and Theon closed his eyes and opened them and took a breath, and then they were running, not like thieves, but like nurses to a child who has finally cried. In the hollow, the ridge lay split like a stone peeled by a wet and patient hand. Within, dark upon dark, lay the thing itself, not metaphor, not rumor. It was not as large as the stories like to make of such things. That would come. It was as large as a cart, as large as the thought you have at midnight that changes your life if you keep it until morning. It shone with no light but its own, which was the color Sansa had decided not to name. It breathed, and the breath had weight and love in it. It shifted once, and the skin under Sansa's hand slid with it, and she was sliding her hand over a living unscarred curve, and every muscle in her back relaxed into a confession she did not have time to make. The eye rose. It opened. It looked at her, not with human recognition but with that attention she had come to crave. She saw herself small in it and saw, not her own face, but a banner shaped like a sentence written by a patient hand. I am here. She laughed aloud and at once clapped her hand over her mouth and then lowered it because nothing in that room would be frightened by joy. The girl said a word in an old tongue she had been taught while wearing a different face, and the dragon turned the eye and looked at her, and the girl's face did something Sansa had never seen it do. She went child-soft for a heartbeat and then shut the softness away as if she had folded a cloak and put it on a shelf and might take it down later if she found herself alone. Theon drew his palm along the edge of the shell, careful as a man shaping a plank, and then, because there are moments you must give your mouth to." He put his forehead to the hide and said, "Into it, be ours." The castle that had been Winterfell took a deeper breath then. From the weirwood down to the stables, through the stones that men had cut and the stones men had learned to live with as they were. The snow outside spun as if a hand had stirred it. The men in the hall spoke the name of a god they did not believe in and a curse in which they did. Ramsay stood with his hand on the back of a chair and the chair side under him as if a warm animal had shifted, and he felt it and felt a thing he had not felt since he was a boy without a name. The sick hope that someone might protect him. He flinched as if struck and became, as men become, the worst thing he could be because he had felt a better thing for an instant and hated the little self for it. He shouted for dogs. The dogs did not come. They had found the scent Theon had laid for them, and it took them to a place where a door would fall and not kill them. Not today, but keep them a while and they would howl, and the howling would be part of the noise that hid the other, truer noise of a dragon lifting its jaw to take its first clean breath. Now, Sansa said, but now did not mean what it might have meant in a song. It did not mean charge. It meant become weight. It meant move like a truth without hurry, without apology. It meant go to the place you have made for yourself in your own story and occupy it as if it were a room, as if it had a hearth, as if your mother had once swept it. They went. They went by the paths they had tested, to the door whose bar would be raised by a boy who had once been one of the children she had watched sliding on ice and who would, this afternoon, feel himself a man because he had lifted wood. They went to the yard where the cart broke a second wheel because men are fools and do not speak to wood as they should. They went to the wall where, at exactly the time agreed, a rope was thrown down by no one in particular at all and 3 knots in it made a ladder for a different day. They went to the hall where men sat and fell silent because their hearing had been taken over by another thing entirely. She did not take down the banners. She put her hands wide on the table and looked at men who had become her enemies by their own acts and said nothing. She let the floor speak. Under her palms, the wood warmed. Under the wood, the stone warmed. Under the stone, the dragon breathed, and breath is not a metaphor. It is a moving of the world inside a body. The men shifted and shifted again, and the space that had been Ramsay's, the space the world gives to the violent by allowing them to be the axis around which the fearful orbit contracted. He felt it and he turned and he smiled, and his smile found no purchase. Theon stood to her right, half a step behind, because a man who has lost the right to stand at a certain place can claim it again only by careful angles. The girl stood to her left, hands empty, because empty hands are honesty and a threat at once. The maester did not come. He was in the rookery, loosing the birds he had kept hungrier than was reasonable so that they would fly willingly and straight. That hunger now would ask something of them that was still less than what men are asked, and he would not apologize to them. Later he would apologize and mean it. Manderley's men were already in the lower town, laughing at a joke about eels and throwing dice that had been shaved so that a man who could count would lose and so a different man would gain, and with his gain feed 2 boys and a dog. John's men had reached the ridge near the mill and would find a woman there who would ask them a question about bread. If they answered it wrong, they would be sent to a whore who would send them back to the wall with a story about their inadequacy. If they answered it right, they would be sent to another woman with a pot of stone and a way of looking at a man that makes him remember his mother even if his mother had been a bad one. "Speak," Ramsay said, because he needed sound to fill the room now, and he had not the imagination to make useful silence. The dogs howled then, the sound coming up through windows and through the trap of the inn yard, and he flinched again and swallowed it with a little laugh and looked for a face to cut. Sansa looked at him and thought of her father's hand on her hair. She said, gentle as water, "No," and the room felt the word and wondered what it meant, and the breath under the floor went in and, slowly, out, and she placed her hands flat to feel it pass through the wood and the hall and the men and the world. They had wanted a war with banners. They would have a winter with breath. They had wanted a sudden end to a chapter they hated. They would have a long sentence, patient and exact and unornamented, that brought them, syllable by syllable, to a period. She could bear that. The girl could bear it with an impatience that would be kept in check by love of precision. Theon would bear it as a penance that set his shoulders in a way that was almost handsome. The dragon would bear it because that is what dragons do. They bear heat in their bodies and wait to change the shape of things when asked in the right voice. Men sat and tasted their fear like broth and did not know how to swallow it. The banners did not fall. Not yet. The air pressed against them as if measuring, and the room made ready to be another room, and the house made ready to be its own name again. And Sansa stood within it and felt the world passing its hand over her and said, "To no one and to everything hold."